What's going on, guys? Junior here, and today I'm gonna show you how to build this application that you're looking at. And this application is a simple server manager application, so you can replace servers with users, customers, or whatever you want. And we're gonna build this application from the ground up. So we're gonna start with the backend, which is gonna be a Spring Boot API that's gonna be connecting to a MySQL database. And then once we're done building the backend API with Spring Boot, we're gonna start working on the front end, where we're gonna be using Angular to build the user interface that you're looking at right now. Maybe in the future I can use RxJs instead of Angular, so that I can show you how you can use the same backend and then use React instead of Angular. But today I'm going to show you how to do it using Angular in the front end and Spring Boot with MySQL in the backend. Just before we begin, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the application that we're going to be building. So it's a simple server manager application where we can manage our servers. At the top, you have the manage servers. So that's like the name of the application. And then we have this drop down here where you can filter all the servers that you have. So right now I'm looking at all the servers, and I can also filter by server up. And you can see this nice animation where all the servers are filtered. And then at the bottom to the left, you can see there was a message here that tells me that the servers have been filtered. And of course, I can filter by server down. You can see the message again. The servers have been filtered, and I'm looking at that one server that is down, or the status is down. So let's go back to all servers, and I have another button here that I can click to add a new server. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to click here, and we have this pop-up window, and I'm going to do 192.168.1.62. I think one of the computers on my network is on the 62, and I think this is my desktop. So I'm going to type in desktop, and I think it's 64 gig. So I'm going to do 64 gig, and let's say home PC. And for now, I'm going to keep the status as down so that we can try to ping this server so that we can see when the status changes. So I'm going to click on add, and I can cancel this and then click it again. You see that the form is still populated, and then I can click on add, and you can see that it's saving. All right, so the server has been added. You can see it at the top here, and the status is server down. So I can click on this ping here so that I can ping the server. And what this is going to do is it's going to try to open a connection to the server and determine if the server is up and running, or if the server is down, or if the server is shut down. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this button and let this go. And you can see that the ping failed. So we weren't able to ping the server. That means that for some reason the server is down, or we can't connect to that server. And I can try to ping a server that is up. So if the server is up and we try to ping the server, but when we're pinging the server is actually down, then you will see that the status will change. So let's try this one, because I don't think I have this 21 on my network. So I'm going to go ahead and click on ping and let this go. You can see that the server is down, so the ping failed, and now the status is server down. And that will work for all these other ones as well. The behavior is going to be the same. And if you look at all these IP addresses, you can see that they're all local network IP addresses. So all these IP addresses are in my network, so in my internal network. And I spin up a server on AWS, so I created an EC2 instance on AWS just so that I could show you that it can also be an external or any IP address on the internet. So let's go ahead and test this external IP address. So I'm going to click on here. I'm going to paste it here because I already have it copied. And then I'm going to say AWS instance. And I think this is 32 gig. And this is a web server. So I set it up as a web server. So I'm going to do web server. And then I'm going to keep the status down. So I can change the status to be up as well. But I'm going to keep it down just so I can show you that I can ping the server and the status is going to change. So I'm going to click on add so that we can save this server. All right, so this is the AWS instance that I have running in AWS. So let's go ahead and ping this server and see what happens. So let's go ahead and ping it. You can see that was really, really fast, and the ping was a success, and now the status is up. And we can also delete a server. So if we no longer want a server on that list, we can go ahead and just delete it by just clicking on this trash icon here. So if I click this, you can see I have the message server deleted, and the server is no longer on the list. And you can also print a report. As you can see here, I have this button in blue on the right. So let's go ahead and click it to generate a report. So I'm going to go ahead and click it, and you can see the server report is down here. I can go ahead and click it to open it, and I'm going to say yes. And you can see that I have all of the information here. So I can clean this data out a little bit. So I can select all the pictures and delete them, and delete this one. And let's say I don't need these two. Delete, and then I can put the borders, and I can make this a little bigger. You can see that we have all of the servers, the IP address, the name, the memory, and the current status at the time when we print out the report. So this application has some functionalities, and if you build this application from the ground up, so you build the backend and you build the front end, it's going to give you a very good idea on how these technologies work. When you have Spring Boot in the backend that's communicating with a MySQL server, and then you have Angular in the front end where you're doing all these things with the UI when you're using Angular services to make HTTP requests, and then you're manipulating the data, you're manipulating the UI and all that. We have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm in Spring Initializer so that I can bootstrap the backend application, and I've already pre-filled all the information on the left, so you can see that I've already selected a group ID, artifact ID, and a name for the project and everything. The package is going to be jar, and the version of Java that I'm going to be using is 11. You can use Java 8 or 9, 10 or whatever, just don't go below 8. And on the right, I have all the dependencies that I'm going to be using. So this is going to be a web application. So I have the Spring Web, and then I need the MySQL drivers, and then I have the validations, and then I have Spring JPA so that I can map my classes to the database as tables. And then I have Lombok to help me with getters and setters. So typical stuff here, nothing crazy. And I'm going to go ahead and generate the project by just clicking on this generate button, and I'm just going to save it. All right. So it's saved as a zip file. So I'm going to go ahead and open this with IntelliJ after I unzip it. I have the brand new project open in IntelliJ, and I'm going to expand this folder right here. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the main application class and expand this so you can see that this is a typical Spring Boot application. So the first thing I want to do is to create a folder and then put all the domains that I'm going to be working with in the application. So I'm going to right click here and go to new, and then go to package. And I'm going to call this model. So you can call this model or domain or whatever else makes sense to you, but usually it's model or domain. And in here, I'm going to create the server that I'm going to be managing. So here I'm going to say server. So this is the class that I'm going to be creating that's going to represent the servers. And the first thing I want to do is to define an ID. So I'm going to go here and do private, and that's going to be of type long, and this is the ID. So this is going to represent the ID of the server, and this is also going to be the primary key in the database. If you've been using JPA, then you already know how this goes, because we need every entry in the table to have a unique identifier. In this case, that's going to be the primary key. And then we need the IP address, and this is going to be a string. So I'm going to do IP address. And we also need the name. So that's the name of the server. I need to do private first, so private string name. So that's going to represent the name. And then we need the memory. So again, private string memory. And then we need the type. So private string type. And then we need the image URL, because every server is going to have a little image to represent that server. So we're going to do private. That's going to be a string, and we're going to call this image URL. And then lastly, we're going to have the status of the server. So I'm going to do another private, and I'm going to create an enum. So I'm going to call it status, and then we're going to call it status. So that's going to represent the server up or server down that we saw in the demo of the application. And I'm going to come here and create another package, and I'm going to call it enumeration. And inside of this package, I'm going to create this status. So I'm going to copy this and right click and create a new class, and I'm going to paste it, and it's going to be an enum. So I'm going to select the enum and then press enter. And the servers, they're going to have two statuses. So we're going to have server up. So I'm going to do server underscore up. So that's going to represent the server up status, and we can put the string in there as well. I'm going to do server underscore up, and then we have the server down. So I'm going to do server underscore down, also put in the string in here, server underscore down, and then semicolon. So because we have the string that represent the status, we also have to define some getters and setters. So I'm going to do private, and that's going to be final. That's going to be a string, which is going to be the status. And then I need to define a constructor. So here I'm going to say status, and then give it the status. So I'm going to do status, and that's going to be the status. And then I'm going to do this dot status equals the status that we got. And I don't know if we're going to need it, but just in case, we're going to do another public, and that's going to return a string, and I'm going to call it get status, and it's not going to take any parameters because it's a getter. And in here, what I want to do is to just return the status. So we're going to say return this status. And then I'm going to put a space here just so we can see everything clearly. And then I'm going to go here and see if I can import that, import class, and it should come from our package. And that should be all we have to do here. And you can see that the error goes away. Now I see that I'm getting errors in the status class. So let's come back here, and I see that I'm passing a status here, but this is actually supposed to be a string. So let's go ahead and fix that. And that should be all we have to do to fix everything. So now we have the class that represent the servers here, but remember, we're gonna be saving everything to a database. So we need to map everything to the MySQL database as a table. So that means we're gonna need to put in some annotation here. So let's go down here. And the first one is gonna be at entity. So at entity, and then we need to add in at data. So that's coming from Lombok so that we can get getters and setters and stuff. And we also need the no args constructor. So no args constructor, and also the all args constructor. So all args constructor. So now this is giving us an error because we put the at entity annotation and we didn't specify an ID, which is going to be the primary key. So we're going to come down to the IDs. By the way, this can also be any other data type or anything that is unique on the class. It doesn't necessarily have to be an ID. And I'm going to do at ID. So that's going to represent the ID. And also we need to tell it how to generate this ID. So I'm going to do at generated value from Java persistence, and I'm gonna give it a strategy of auto because it doesn't really matter at this case. So we're just gonna give it this strategy. So let's make sure we import everything, import from JavaX, and import this as well. More action, import static. Another thing that I want to do is I don't want this IP address to be empty. So whenever we're saving a new server, at least we have to get the IP address if you don't get anything else to be able to save something in the database. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a constraint. So I'm going to do at column and I'm going to pass in the unique. So I'm going to say unique, set this to true. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a constraint on this IP address so that we can't have more than one IP address of the same number. So if we try to save something in a database and we already have the same IP address, then it's going to throw us a constraint exception in MySQL. And that's just going to make the application throw an exception overall. So the user will never be able to save the same IP address twice. And then we're going to add the validation. So here I'm going to say not empty. So this is why we brought in the validation, and then we can also pass in a message for that. We're gonna say IP address cannot be empty or null. Okay, so that's gonna make sure that whenever they're sending a request, they must send an IP address, otherwise this is gonna catch it and it's gonna throw an exception. So we have our validations on the IP address. The column unique true is gonna create a constraint, so we can only have one IP address in the database. So if we try to save the same IP address again, then it's gonna give us an error. So that's what this column unique is doing. So we're making sure that this is unique in the database. And then also we don't accept any request that comes in without having this IP address if it's null or anything like that, because we have this not empty. So it's gonna check to make sure that the IP address is there whenever there's a request coming in with this object. And that's all we have to do for this class. What we have to do now is to define a way for us to be able to manipulate the data in the database, which means that we need some way in the Java code so that we can manipulate data in the database. So if we want to save a new server, update a server, or delete a server, or list all the servers, so we need to have a way in the Java to be able to do that in MySQL. And that's why we brought in the JPA, because JPA is going to make this really easy. So what we have to do is to just go ahead and create a new package. By the way, you don't have to create a package for everything. It just help organize the code. So you want to create a separate package for different parts of your application. So everything that is related together, you want to make sure you put them in the same package. So here I'm going to create something called a repository. So I'm going to say repo, for example. So that's going to be the name of the package. And then inside of that package, I'm going to create an interface, and I'm going to do class and select interface, and I'm going to call it server repo. So we're going to do server repo. So repo is short for repository, but you can name it repository if you want. So what we have to do here is to extend a class called the JPA repository. So we're going to extend JPA repository, and you can see it coming up here. Now, when we extend this class, we need to give it two pieces of information. The first piece is the domain or the class that we want to manage. In that case, that's going to be the server. So that should come from our model. And then we have to give it the type of the primary key. In our case, that was the long type. And if we go back inside of the server, you can see that the primary key here, so the field in the class with the ID annotation, So that's a long type. So that's what we're giving to this server repository here. We're saying, hey, we're managing the server, so we can update, delete, read all the servers in the database, and also the type is long. So by extending this class, we have access to a bunch of methods that we can use, and I can go inside of this class so that I can show you. So this is going to list everything we have in the database. This is going to list them, but also we can pass in a sort. That's going to sort everything. We can also save some kind of a list or a collection. So you can see that we have access to a bunch of methods already that we can use to manipulate the data inside of the MySQL server. So we don't have to define all this manually. But I do want to define one method manually, which is to find a server by the IP address. So I'm going to say this is going to return a server, and I'm going to call it find by IP address. So the name here is very important, because when you do find by, then you're telling JPA that you're trying to do a select and you want to select by whatever you put here. So wherever the IP address equal whatever we're going to pass here inside of the parameter of the function. So here I'm going to say string IP address. And also this field should exist in your class. So I'm going to finish this with a semicolon. So the find by tells JPA to select a server, and then it's going to check to compare the IP address here with the IP address that we pass in here. And another example, just so you can understand this. So for instance, if we know that the name was going to be unique, so that when we try to find a server by that name, it's going to return one server. In the repository, we could do something like find by name. So just to give you an example, I could do something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing and then go down and paste it. And then we can do find by, and then we pass in name. And then here we would pass in the name. So that would work as well. So we would pass in the name of the server we want to find, and then find by would select that server by that name. So as long as you have this field in your class, then this will work. And this is a language that you can actually learn with JPA, like how to construct your methods so that they can be equivalent to certain SQL queries. But that wouldn't work in our case. Multiple servers can have the same name, so that's not going to work in this case, because if we try to do it this way, it's going to say, hey, I return more than one value, and it's going to throw an exception, because that's not going to be unique. So I'm going to get rid of that. But I know that the IP addresses, they're going to be unique. So I can, define this find by IP address. And I know every time it's supposed to either give me a server or tell me that it didn't find anything, any server by that IP address. So extending the JPA repository is how you manage your information or your data in the database, because this will allow you to save information in a database, update them, delete them, etc. And also there is a lot more we can do with the JPA repository, but I'm just giving you a small example. But you can really take this to the next level and define multiple different methods, and by just the name, JPA is going to interpret the name and be able to sort things and limit things and do all kinds of stuff that you can actually do with SQL queries. So now we have the model that we want to manipulate. So that's going to be the servers. And then we have a way to manipulate it by using the JPA repository, by creating this server repository that we're calling server repo. The next thing we have to do is to define the different functionalities that we want to have in the application. And to do this, we can define a service, and then we define methods that's going to represent the different features that we want to have in the application. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the main package and create another package. And then I'm going to name it service. Press enter, and inside of the service package, I'm going to create a server service, and that's going to be an interface. So I'm going to select interface, and then I'm going to name it server service and press enter. So inside of this service, I'm going to define all the different functionalities or features that I want the application to have. So I'm going to go down, and I want to be able to save a server in a database. So we're going to create a function that's going to return a server, and it's going to call it create. And this is going to take the server that the user is trying to save. So we're going to give it a server, and what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and create the server and then save it in the database. So let's go ahead and import this, and that's supposed to come from our model, and everything looks good. Next, we want to be able to list all the servers. We're going to create something that's going to return a collection of servers. So we're going to say server, and let's just call this list. So it's going to list all the servers, and I'm going to make it take a limit, which is going to be an integer, and I'm going to call it limit. Now you could make this take a page because we can also return a page to the user. But in this case, I just want to limit the number of servers or the number of rows that I'm returning when I try to call this method to list all of the servers. So let's say if I pass this limit to be 10, so if I have, for example, 100 servers in the database, then it's going to give me the first 10. It's not going to give me all the 100. And then I'm going to define another one that's going to also return a server that I'm going to call get. And this is just going to take the ID of the server that we want to find. So that's going to be the ID. And then another one that's going to return the server is going to be update. And this is going to also take the server. So we can give it a server to update, and it's going to take that server with the updated information and it's going to save it in a database. And lastly, I need one to delete a server. So it's going to return a Boolean, true or false. I'm going to call it delete. And it's also going to take the ID of the server. So we just give it the ID. It's going to go in the database, find the server by that ID, and then delete it. And as you can see, this is an interface. So we're not really implementing anything. This is just functionalities that we're laying down that we want to have in the application. So we want to have a way to implement these functionalities so that we can actually use them. And that's why we created the repo, because with the repo, we can create, we can list, we can get, we can update and delete. So we're going to create an implementation of this server service, and then using the server repository, we'll be able to create an implementation for all of these functionalities or features that we just defined. And you can define as many functionalities or features as you want in this class, and you can implement all of them, or you can just implement some of them. But in my case, I only need these 5. So I'm just going to define these 5 and then implement them. So in the same service folder where we have the server service, let's create another folder, and I'm just going to call it implementation. And inside of the implementation, I'm going to create the server service implementation. So server service implementation, and press enter. And of course, this is going to implement the server service. So we're going to say implement server service. So now once we implement the server service, of course, we have to implement all the methods inside of this service. As you can see, IntelliJ is helping me here. And you can see we have all of the methods that are coming from the server service. So all these methods now, we have to implement them in the server service implementation because we're implementing this interface server service. So before we actually try to implement everything here, there is one important method that I forgot to put in, which is the method to ping the server. So let's go back into the service, and right below the first method, I'm going to create another function. I'm going to call it ping, and it's going to return the server that we're pinging, and it's going to take the IP address. So we're going to say IP address. So we're going to give it an IP address, and what it's going to do is it's going to try to ping that server and then return the server that we were just trying to ping. So it's going to go in the database, find the server by that IP address, and then ping the server and then return the pinged server. And the reason that I'm returning the ping server is because in case the status has changed, I can also show that updated status in the UI whenever I get this return server back to me. So now we have to go to the implementation and then add this one method. So implement method, the ping, click OK, and you can see that it's added right here. So now we have all of the functionalities that we want, and now we just have to implement them. So the first thing I want to do is to bring in the server repo, because with this repository, we can actually do all the things that we need to do in the implementation, as you can see here. So I'm going to go up here, and then I'm going to define a private field. So I'm going to say private final, and then I'm going to name it server repo, and then give it the same name, server repo. And I'm gonna bring in an annotation here. So I'm gonna go up and then do add required args constructor. So because I have this required args constructor, Lombok is gonna create a constructor, and then it's gonna put this field inside of the constructor, and this is gonna be our dependency injection. So instead of creating the constructor ourselves, Lombok is gonna do it for us with this annotation. And we also need to make this a service. So I'm gonna say service. And also I need to bring in the transactional. So I'm going to do transactional. And lastly, I need to bring in the log. So I'm going to do at SL F4J. So this is going to allow us to have something printed in the console so that we can see exactly what's happening. So at this point, we're ready to implement those methods. So let's go ahead and start working on those. I'm going to put a space here, and I'm going to scroll up a little. And what I want to do in the create is to log. So I'm going to go ahead and do log that info, and we're going to pass in a message. So I'm going to say saving new server, and then let's say we want to show the name of the server. So I'm going to do open and close curly braces, and then put a comma, and then try to get the name of the server. So I'm going to do server.getName. So that's gonna give us a log in the console that's gonna say saving server and then pass in the name of the server. The next thing I want to do is to create an image for the server. So I'm gonna do server that set image URL, not ID. And then let's say I'm gonna create a method and let's call it set image. Let's do set server image URL, and it's not going to take any parameters. So let's go ahead and see if we can define this function. All right, so we're going to create this, and for now let's make it return like null, for example, just so that we don't get an error. But I'm going to also move this to the bottom, and then we're going to work on it later. So I'm going to paste it here just like that. So we're gonna come back to this and then we're gonna work on it because we need to set an image URL for every server that we save. And then after I set the image URL, I can go ahead and save the server. So I'm gonna go here, call the server repo. So we're gonna say server repo. And then because we extend the JPA repository, we have this save, which is pretty much how we save something in the database. And then here we're going to pass it the server. So whenever we're using this method to create a server, it's going to log something into the console, set the image of the server because we're not going to ask the user for an image. And then we're going to save the server in the database and also return that server. So let's go ahead and work on the second method. So for the ping, that's going to be a little bit interesting. I'm going to go ahead and copy the log and paste it here. And we want to say something else. So let's say pinging server, and let's pass in the IP. So we're going to say pinging server IP and then pass in the IP address. So we're going to say IP address. So we're going to have something in the log that's going to say pinging server IP, and then it's going to show us the IP address of the server. Now remember, at this point, we don't have the server that the user is trying to ping. We only have the IP address. And let's go ahead and see if we can find that server. So we're going to find the server. We're going to name it server and then call the server repo that find by IP address and then give it the IP address. So this is going to go into the database, select the server by that IP address. So what we have to do now is to try to ping the server. So to do this, we're going to do inet address. Let's call this address and then do inet address again, get by name, and then we're going to give it the IP address. So we're going to say IP address. So this is going to give us the inet address. And then once we have that inet address, we can check to see if the server is reachable, and we can do server.set status. So set status and then take the address and see if it's reachable. So we're going to say is reachable. And then let's say we're going to give it 10,000. And after this timeout, if we can't reach the server, then the code is going to continue its course. And then here I'm going to put a question mark and then I'm going to say server up, and let's see if we can do a static import for this. Otherwise, we're going to set the status to be server down. So I'm going to go up here, put a colon, and then we're going to say server down. So what are we doing here? So we're getting the inet address for that specific IP address, and then we're going to set the status of the server. So what I'm doing here is just checking to see if we can reach the server within this timeout. So if we can reach the server within this timeout, then I'm going to set the status to server up because I know the server is up. Otherwise, the server is going to be down. So since we edit the status of the server, then we have to save the server in the database with the new status. So I'm going to call the server repo, call save again, pass in the server, and then lastly we're going to return that server. So then we're going to say return server, and we're getting an error because this is supposed to throw an exception. So we're just gonna add it to the method signature just like that. So you can see how this is making sense, and I'm gonna show you another / better way to try to ping a server, but this is reachable. It's gonna work fine. After I'm finished adding all of the implementations for all these methods, I'm gonna create another method that you can use if you really want to try to reach a server using the java.net package. They have really nice features and methods and things that you can use to see if you can establish a connection with a remote server. So I'm going to show you how to do that. But for now, this is going to work for us. This is reachable. It's going to work for us at this point. Let's go ahead and scroll down, and we have to work on this list. So let's go ahead and copy this log and just paste it here. I'm going to say something like fetching all servers, and we don't need the IP address. And all I have to do here is to return the server repo, and we want to call the find all. And as you can see, for the find all, we can pass a page. So if you scroll down, you can see there's one where we can pass a page, and that's the one that we're going to use. So I'm going to do find all. I'm going to pick any one of them, and then I'm going to create a page. So I can say something like page requests, and then I do of, and you can see I can pass in a page and the size. So I'm gonna select the first one, and I'm gonna say give me the first page, so page 0, which means it's gonna start from the beginning. And then let's say I'm gonna pass in the limit, which is an integer. So this is gonna return a page, and we can just convert it to a list because we're returning a list. And I can do a static import for this. So if you really want to return a page, you can go ahead and return a page, but I want to return a list. But when I'm returning that list, I also want to limit. I don't want to get all the servers. Let's say if I have like 500 servers, the find all is going to try to return all of these servers. So I don't want to do that. I want to just limit the number of servers that I get back when I try to list all the servers. So that's why I pass in this limit by passing the first page. So that's going to be page 0, and then give me like 10 or 30 or the first 5 or something like that. And then of course, since we pass this argument inside of the find all, it would return a page instead of a list or anything collection. So we transform this into a list by just adding that to list to it. And I'm gonna go ahead and scroll down and copy the log as well and paste this here. I'm gonna say fetching. I'm gonna delete this, and I'm gonna say server by ID, and then pass in the ID. So I'm gonna put opening and close curly braces, and then pass in the ID so that we know what ID we're trying to fetch the server for. And then all I have to return is the server repository. So server repository that find by ID, as you can see down here, pass in the ID, and then we need to call the get. So when we call the get, that's going to return the actual server that it finds by that specific ID. So now let's go ahead and work on the update. So the update is another save. I'm going to scroll up and copy all this and go down and then paste it here for the update, and just remove this image because when we update, we're not going to update the image. And then I'm going to say updating server, and then pass in the name of the server. And this is just another save. The difference is when you pass the ID, then JPA is smart enough to know that it's an existing ID, like it finds it in the database, then it's gonna do an update. If there's no ID or the ID is null, then it's gonna do a create, or it's gonna add the server in the list or in the database. And let's go ahead and scroll down. Now we have to work on the delete. So let's copy this log one more time and paste it here. And we're gonna say deleting server, and then pass the ID, pass in the ID like this. We can say by ID. All we have to do is to delete. So we're gonna call the repository again, call the delete, pass in the ID. Actually, we have to call delete by ID, pass in the ID, and then here we can go ahead and return true. So like that, and do a static import for this. So if this is successful, then it's going to reach this line. So that's going to return true. Otherwise, this is going to throw an error. So we'll never reach this line on line 74. So that was pretty easy, by the way, using JPA. But I have to tell you, when we're working with really large and complex application, it's never going to be like this easy at all. And I'm going to have more content coming out where I'm going to show you that when you're really working with real world application and things are really complex, it's never going to be that easy coding it so smoothly like that. But I'll show you in the future that when the application is complex, it becomes really hard to use JPA because we want to do a lot more complex operations in the data using SQL. And because we're trying to do these operations, then we're kind of like forced to use SQL queries and then pass them into Java and then have the application execute those queries instead. But for now, this is going to do, JPA is going to do. JPA is actually very powerful. So for a lot of applications, JPA should be all you need to manipulate your data in a database. I have these 4 images inside of this images folder. As you can see here inside of my downloads, I have a folder called images, and I have 4 different images of servers that I want to assign to a server. And I want to do this at random. So I want to pick a random image here and then assign it to a server whenever we're trying to set the image of the server. So what I want to do is to just go down, and where we're setting the image of the servers, I'm going to define an array. I'm going to do string, and that's an array. So I'm going to put opening and closing bracket, and I'm going to call it image names. And I'm going to set it equal to all these names that I have. So inside of this array, I'm going to define the server images. So here, what did I call them? So let's go back to this folder. And I have server 1, server 2, server 3.png, and server 4.png. So I'm going to do server 1.png and just copy this and do it 4 times because I have 4 of them. And I'm going to change this to 4 change this to 3, and change this to 2. So server 1, server 2, server 3, server 4. And I want to pick one of these at random and then assign it as the URL for that specific server, because I don't really care what the server is. I just want to assign some image for it just to improve the UI experience. So I'm going to go down and then I'm going to do, well, we already have a return. So I'm going to use that return. So what we want to return is a servlet URI. We need the component builder, and then we want the from current context path, and then we're going to add a path to it, and that's going to be a string. So we're going to have to create this in the controller later when we're building the resource. So here we're going to do server / image. I'm going to collapse this for more room so that you guys can see. So when we're returning this URL, it's going to be localhost 8080 / server / image, and then / server1.png or server 2 or server 3 or server 4.png. So we need to append one of these servers at random to this path that we're creating here. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to add a / and then I'm going to say plus, and I want to get an image at random. So I'm going to do images, and I want to put bracket because I want to pick one at random, and then I'm going to do new random, and that's coming from Java util, and then call the next int because I want to get an integer that's going to be the index of the specific image that I want, because I have like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I have 0, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to go ahead and pass 4 in here and then convert this to a URI string. So I'm going to do that to URI string, and this is going to return a string. And this bound, what it's doing is it's making sure that whenever we're creating this random number, we never go above 3. So the 4 is the bound, which means we're never going to reach the 4. So our indices are going to be 0 for the first one, and then 1, 2, and then 3. So that way we never go out of bound. And that's all we have to do for this method. So before I create the controller, I want to have a way to send a response to the user. So every time I want to send the same response, either if I get an error or if I have a success, then I want to send the same response to the user. So what I'm going to do inside of the model, I'm going to define another class. I'm going to call it response. And this is something that I like to do. You don't necessarily have to do it, but I like to send, oh, I made a mistake in this. So let's rename this. This is response. Yeah, like I was saying, I like to use a particular class and then return it every time that I'm building an API so that my API can be consistent. So inside of this class, I'm going to do protected, and I'm going to do local datetime, and I'm going to do a timestamp for this. So timestamp, and I want to do another protected, and this is going to be the status code. So I'm going to do status code. And another protected, this is going to be the HTTP status. So I'm going to do HTTP status, and this is coming from Spring Framework, and I'm going to call this the status. And then I want the reason. So if I have an error in the application, I want to send the reason for the error. So this is going to be a string, and I'm going to do another protected. That's also going to be a string, and this is going to be a message. So this is a success message. So typically whenever there's a request that comes in and the operation was successful, then I'm going to return this message, and the user can use that message in the front end to show like a notification to the user or something like that, which is exactly what we're going to use when we're working on the front end to show the loader notification. And then I like to have a developer message. So that's going to be another string, and I'm going to call it developer message. So this is a message that's going to be like more technical and more detailed. And if a developer want to take a look at this message, or they want to send that message over to some other services or something like that in the front end, so they can use that message, something that is meant for a developer. And then lastly, and most importantly, is the data. And I'm going to do a map for this, and it's going to be a map of anything, and I'm just going to call it data. And you're going to see how this is going to come handy in a minute whenever we're using this class to send information over to the user to the front end. So this class is going to represent the response that I'm going to send to the user every time there's a request that comes into the application. Either if I'm sending a success response or a failure response, it's always going to be this class that's going to be embedded in the body of the response that we're going to send across the entire application so that our application can be consistent. And I also need to add in some annotations. So I'm going to do at data coming from Lombok, and I'm going to use the builder pattern. So I'm going to do super builder. And lastly, I want to only include values that are not null. So I'm going to do JSON include. So I'm going to do non-null, which is this one that I'm looking for. And I'm going to go ahead and do a static import for this. So what this annotation is going to do is, since I'm going to be sending this whether I'm sending a successful response or a failure response, right? So if I'm sending a success response, then this developer message is going to be null because I have no developer message because it's a success. This message is going to have some value to it, but this developer message and this reason, these two are going to be null. So because they're null, then they're not going to be included in this response at all whenever we're sending it to the front end. So that's what this annotation is doing. It's really handy. When something is null, just don't show it at all to the user. So I'm going to be using this class as the response body that I'm going to be sending every time to the user whenever they send a request to the application. So now all we have to do is to create a controller and then use this class to send responses back to the user when they access our application. So now everything is in place for us to expose all of these functionalities over HTTP. So I'm going to close all of these tabs and collapse some of these. And in the main package, I'm going to create another package. I'm going to call it resource. Inside of that resource package, I'm going to go ahead and create a new controller class, and I'm going to call it server resource. You can call this controller, but typically when it's a REST controller like a REST API, it's usually called a resource, but that's technically the controller. So at REST controller, and then I want to do a request mapping. So I'm going to do at request mapping, and I want everything in this class to live under server. So I'm going to do /server. And the first thing I need to do is to bring in the service implementation, because that's what we're going to call every time we need to do something in the backend. So we're going to do server service implementation, and we're going to call it server service, for example. And if you remember, if we go inside of the server service, we define this as a final field inside of the class. And then we use the required args constructor, which is going to create the constructor and then pass this in inside of the constructor, which will be the dependency injection. So we need to do something similar here. So that's why I define this as a private field. And then we just need to add the annotation in here. So once I do this, you're going to see that this error is going to go away because now we're doing our dependency injection properly. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse this and then go down. I'm going to define a public method, and it's going to return a response entity. So we're going to do response entity, and that's going to be of type response. So the body is going to be the response that we created in our model. And then I'm going to call this get servers. So that's going to return the list of all the servers that we have in the application. And then inside of this method, I want to return the response entity, and then I'm going to call the OK on that class. And you can see that the OK takes a body, and for the body, we're going to pass in our response. So I'm going to call my response. And since we're using the builder pattern, so I can call the builder and then pass in the information that I need to pass. So here I can put that timestamp, and then I'm going to pass now. And then I'm going to do data. So for the data, we need a map. So that's going to be a map of, and then we can pass in the information that we need. So I'm going to say this is going to be the servers. So the key is going to be servers. And then the value inside of that map is going to be all the servers that we're going to retrieve. So I'm going to call the server service that list. And then let's say we want the first 30. So I'm passing in a hard coded value, as you can see here. But if you want, you can take this as a parameter, ask the user for that parameter, of course, and then pass it in here. Otherwise, you can pass in a default. But me, I'm just passing in this hard coded value because I know I'm not going to have, not more than like 10 or 15 servers at a time in the application. And then after I pass the data, I can pass in the message. So I'm going to say the message is going to be servers retrieve, for example. And then I can pass in the status. So I'm going to say status is going to be OK. And then the status code, we need that. So the status code is going to be the same status. And then we're going to call the value on that. So that's going to give us the actual number. So for the OK, it's going to be like a 200. And then lastly, we're going to call build. And then I'm going to press Control-Alt-L to see if I can format everything and then see if I can import those. So I'm going to put my mouse on here, go to more action, import, and import this OK as well. More action, and then OK. So all the errors are gone. And then the last thing we have to do is to add an annotation on this so that we can expose it. So I'm going to go up here and then put add. This is going to be a get mapping. So I'm going to do get mapping, and then I'm going to give this a route. So this is going to go to servers.list. and I have to put a // just like that. So when we start the application and then we go on the base path, so that's going to be localhost 8080 and then /server/list, then it should give us this response that we're creating here. And as soon as we finish with this controller, we're going to go ahead and try it. So let's go ahead and continue with the other methods. I'm going to go ahead and do a static import for this map as well. So I'm going to go here, add static import, and then I'm going to go ahead and copy this function, scroll down and paste it. So this is going to go to the ping /, and remember we need some way to capture the IP address. So here I'm going to say IP address. So we're going to grab the IP address of the server that we're trying to ping, and I'm going to change the name of the method as well. Name this ping server, remove that S, and here we have to pass in the path variable that we're grabbing in the URL. So for this, we're going to use another annotation called path variable, then give it the name that we're grabbing. In this case, that's the IP address, and then we're going to define this as a string, which is going to be IP address. And then what I want to do first is to see if I can ping the server. So we're going to do server, define the server here, and then we're going to call the service, so service, and then see if we can ping the server. So we're going to call the ping, you can see it here, and that takes the IP address. So once we ping the server, whether it's successful or not, that doesn't really matter. We're just going to change the status of the server. And as for our data, we're just going to return the server. So I'm going to change the key in the map to server and then pass in the server as the value in our map. Everything else is going to be the same, but the message is going to be different. So this message that we're sending back to the user, this message is going to be different. So what I want to do is to check to see if the ping was successful or not. So I'm going to say server that get status, and then check to see if it equals server up. So I'm going to do server up and then put a question mark. So I'm just checking to see if the status is up. If that's the case, then I'm going to say ping success. Otherwise, I'm going to say something else. Ping fail. And let's do a static import for that as well so that we can save some space. So the message is going to be ping success or ping failure, depending on what the status is at this point, because we know that after we ping the server, if the ping was successful, the status is going to be server up, so that we can say, okay, if the server is up, then the ping was a success. Otherwise, the ping was a failure, because this is going to return false. So it's going to jump to this string. And we have to add the exception to the method signature. We can just do that here so that we don't have to use a track hatch block. And that's all we have to do for the ping. Let's go ahead and copy this one more time and then scroll up, and I'm going to paste it down. And I'm going to change this to a post request, because this is where we're going to try to save a server. And I'm going to change the URL as well to save. So it's going to be save, and change this to save server. And inside of here, we're going to use the add request body, because we're going to be sending the body and the request. I'm going to say request body, and I'm also going to use the valid annotation. So I'm going to say add valid. You can see that it's coming from JavaX validation, which is the dependency that we add in. And then here we're going to say server, and then we're going to give it a name of server. And I'm going to remove this exception because I don't think we're going to be using it, and remove this line as well. And this is supposed to be post mapping. So we're going to grab the body of the request, which is going to contain the server, and we also put at valid, which is going to check for the validation that we added. So if I press control and go inside of the server, we're going to check for this annotation here, which is the validation. So let's go back, and what we need to do is to do something very similar that we've been doing. So if everything is successful, it's not going to be an okay response. So this is going to be created. So I'm going to change this to created, and then do the same thing below. So this is going to give us the 201, which is the status for created. And we can go inside of this if we want. You can see that 201 is a successful response for created. So whenever a resource is created on the server, and that's what we're using here. And we can also use the created here. So if I do control space, you can see that there's a created that we can use as well, but that takes a URI, and I want to be able to send a response to the user. So if we use the created, then we won't be able to send a response. There's another way we can do this by just returning a new response entity, and then we can fill in all the class information for the constructor. But the OK is also an unacceptable response for when something is created on the server. So I'm just going to leave it as OK, but you can do something else as well. So the timestamp is always going to be now. So whenever we're returning the response, And here for the map for our data, we're also going to keep the server because we're going to return the server that got created. And here we're going to call the service. So we're going to say server service.create, which is also going to return the server. And then we're going to pass it the server. So this is going to return the created server. And that's the server that we're going to pass in as part of the data to the response. And of course, the message is not going to be ping failure or success. It's going to be server created. So something really simple. And this message can be anything you want. And you can also notice that we're not using the developer message or reason here because we're not dealing with any errors in this case. And that's all we have to do for this method. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit and copy the ping server method and then go down and then paste it. And this is going to be the one to get a server. So I'm going to call it get server. And we want to make this go to get. We're going to pass in the ID. So I'm going to remove everything and then set this to ID. The param is also going to be the ID. And we want to get the ID as a long and then pass in the ID. Remove the exception because I don't think we're going to be throwing an exception in this case. Remove this line as well. And everything is going to be the same except that here we're going to call the service. So we're going to call the service and then call the get, pass in the ID. So this is going to return the server as part of our data and the response, and change the message here as well. So I'm going to remove all this and then say something like server retrieve. And that's pretty much everything we have to do for the get server. So we're going to get the ID and the path of the URL and then get it in here as a long and then call the service to get that specific server. And then we're going to pass it in as part of our data. And then everything else is the same. So I'm going to copy this one more time and scroll down and then paste it. And this is going to be the delete mapping. So I'm going to change this to delete mapping, and this is going to go to delete. So I'm going to change this to delete, and we also need the ID when we're deleting, and I'm going to change the method name to delete. So delete server. We're also going to get the ID, and instead of get, we're going to call the delete, pass in the ID, and then we're going to pass in the message here. So we're going to say deleted. So that's going to be either true or false. So for the data, it's going to be a key of deleted, and that's going to be either true or false. Of course, we're never going to see the false because it's going to throw an exception, but just in case, you never know what can happen. So this is going to be either true or false, and that's how we're going to know that the server was deleted. And then we're going to change the message as well to deleted, and everything else is going to be the same. So you can see that this is really just a rinse and repeat, and that makes everything really easy when everything is consistent. You can see that every time we're sending the same response to the front end. Now, the last method that I need to add inside of this controller is the one that's going to read the URL for the image of the server and then return the actual image to the front end. So I'm going to copy this again one more time and the last time, and then go down and paste this. So this is going to be a get mapping. So I'm going to delete all this, put a G here and remove that E. So get mapping, and that's going to go to, remember, this has to be the same path that we define on the server image. So if we go back real quick inside of the implementation and scroll down, so the path has to be server/image and then the image name. So let me just copy this and close out of this. So remember, this entire class is living under server. So we have that first portion of the URL, and then we want this to go to image. All right, so I'm going to remove some of those /, and we want the image name. So that's going to be inside of the URL as well. So I'm going to say file name. Okay, so that's going to be like server1 or server2 or server3.png. And then we're going to grab the file name and we're going to pass it in here, and that's going to be a string. So that's the file name. And I'm going to remove all of this because we're not going to return anything as a response or anything like that. All we need to return is the bytes that we can read from that file. So I'm going to change the return type as well. That's going to be byte and array. So that's going to be a bunch of bytes, and we're going to say get server image. Okay, so that's the name of the function. And I need to pass in another parameter for the get annotation, and we need to pass the at here. All right, so at get mapping. So we need to pass in another parameter, and for me to be able to do this, I have to specify each parameter that I'm passing in here inside of this function. So the first one is the path, like you already know. So we're going to set the path to that. So if you're not going to pass in anything else, you don't need to say path equal. You just pass in the path. But if you're going to pass something else, then you have to specify the path so that you can differentiate between the different parameters that you're passing. And the second one that I want to pass in is produces. I want to pass in image_png_value and close that. So let's go ahead and import this. let's go to more action and import static constant, and it's supposed to come from media type. So let's go ahead and select that. So if we go in here, it's only gonna say image.png because we have PNG images. So if we go back and close this, we're explicitly saying that this is producing PNG values. So that's going to be some sort of image, not a JSON. So by default, for instance, for those functions or those methods, they're returning JSON. But here we're explicitly saying this is going to return an image of type PNG. So now all we have to do is to go to that location and see if we can read the bytes for that image and then return that. So I'm going to do files and I want to do read all bytes. As you can see, it's coming up here. And this takes a path. So I'm going to say paths.get. And then we need to pass in a URI. So remember, this is inside of my downloads, inside of the folder called images. So I'm going to say system.getProperty. And I want to go to my home folder. So that's going to be user.home. So that's going to do like whatever my username is and then put me inside of the home folder for that computer. And then I need to go to the downloads. So I'm going to put a plus sign and then do downloads, and then I need to go inside of images, so that's the name of the folder, and then /, and then I need to add in the file name. So I'm gonna do plus, and we have the file name that's coming up here, and then end this with a semicolon. So this is going to give us an error because it throws an exception. We can just add it to the meta signature like this. So when we set the image URL on the servers, then when we load it in the browser, by default, the browser is going to send a GET request, and that's going to be intercepted by this method. And the GET request is going to have the file name. It's going to be something like localhost 8080 /image /server1.png. So we're grabbing the server1.png, we're going inside of that folder and then try to read the bytes from the file, and that's exactly what we're returning. And this is going to return the image itself. So that's pretty much everything we have to do in the controller. So our application is almost ready to be tested, and we're going to be doing that very soon. What I want to do is to add in some servers in the database so that we can see something when we try to, let's say when we try to list all the servers that we have, because if we try to do that right now, we're just going to get an empty array. It's not going to have anything in it. So let's go into the main application file, and I'm going to go ahead and close all this. So inside of the main application file, we can define a bean of type command line runner, and that's going to run after the application has been initialized. And then we can just save some servers in there so that when we go to the browser, we can actually see something. So I'm going to do command line runner. You can see it coming up here, and I'm just going to name it run and give it the server repo. So I'm going to say server repo, give it the same name, and then open and close. And inside of there, I want to return an error function. So I'm going to do args error function, and every piece of code that I put in there will run after the application has been initialized. So what I can do is call the server and then save some new servers. So I'm going to do new server and pass in null for the ID so that JPA knows that this is a new server, and I need to pass in an IP address. So let's say 192.168.1.160, for example. Have to give it a name. So let's say Ubuntu Linux, for example. Have to give it a memory, so let's say this is a 16 gig, and then I have to give it a type. So let's say this is a personal computer, so PC, and then I have to give it an image. So that's supposed to be http://localhost:8080, and remember this is supposed to go to server/image/ let's give this server1.png, and then lastly we have to give it a status. So I'm gonna say server up, for example. So this is really going over, so I'm gonna put this on a new line just like that, and then put the semicolon, and then see if I can do a static import for this just like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and add some more servers, and then I'm gonna come back so that we can run this. So I went ahead and added 4 servers here. As you can see, I have 4 servers added with different status and everything. And then I'm going to put the bean annotation on top of this so that this can get picked up by Spring. All right. So now when we start the application, we're going to have something saved in the database. The last thing we have to do is to put in the configuration for our database connection. So let's close this class and let's go back to the resource. So I'm not using templating. So I'm going to delete these 2 folders because I don't need them, because this is an API. Like we're not going to have any HTML files in here or anything like that. And then I'm going to change this to a YAML file. So I'm going to refactor this and change the extension to YAML. Oops, lowercase. And I'm just going to go inside of this file and then paste the configuration, because this configuration is always going to be the same every time. So I don't want to have to type this while you watch. All we're doing is defining the location of the database and the name of the database. So that's on our local host because the MySQL server is running on my local host. And the name of the database is serverdb. And then my password and my username. I define the dialect, so kind of like the version, which is version 8 that I have installed. And then I want to format all the log and I want to show all the log. So that's a very small configuration that we're doing for the database. And this is also assuming that you have MySQL installed on your computer already, because we're not gonna go through that. So if you already have MySQL installed, then that should work for you. You just have to change the information here to match your information and also change the version as well if you don't have version 8. And you can use Postgre or whatever relational database that you want to use. In this case, I have MySQL installed, so I'm just using MySQL, but you can use Postgre or whatever else you want. As long as it's a relational database, then everything should work fine. So if we didn't make any mistakes at this point, if we run the application, everything should work. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the application, and if we did everything right, then we shouldn't have any errors or anything like that. So you can click on this button here, or you can go into the main class, right click it, and then just go to run server application, and that should start the application. So let's see what happens. All right, the application started with no errors, and we can also see the logs that our table has been created. So to verify this, let's go ahead and open MySQL Workbench. You can use any client you want, but I'm going to be using the Workbench for MySQL. So I'm just going to go ahead and open that. And you can see that I created this server DB. So make sure this is created, and I'm going to expand this and refresh this by just clicking on this refresh icon. And inside of here, you can see that I have this server table created. So that means that everything went well and we didn't get any errors. And we can click on this little gear here so we can describe the table. So you can see that we have our ID, it's a primary key, it's not null, and you can see that we have the IP address, it's a unique key, so you can see that this is checked off. So our constraint is there, and you can see all the other fields that we have in the class, they have been mapped to this table. So we can go ahead and click on this little calendar icon to bring everything up. And if I zoom in a little bit so that you can see what we did. So we run this query, and you can see that we have all the information that we added when the application ran. Then we save all this data. So our data is there, application is running, so we can go ahead and test it in a browser or any HTTP client. So I'm gonna go ahead and minimize that, and I'm gonna open Postman because I'm gonna be using Postman. And I'm gonna open a new tab, and here I want to send a request. So I'm gonna do HTTP, and that's 8080, and I don't need to go to API greetings. I want to go to server, and I want to go to list. Okay, so if we go back to the application for 1 second, and let's minimize this and go to the resource, open the server resource, make some room. So we're gonna go to /server/list. So this is gonna go into the database and grab the first 30 items that we have in that table. And we only have like 4, so we should get everything that we have. So let's go back to Postman and go ahead and run this. Also remember the method is get, because we don't want to send any other method to this URL. It's supposed to be get. So let's go ahead and send this request. And you can see I got a very beautiful response. I got the timestamp, the status code, the status, the message, and you can see that in the data for the key, we have an object. And that object contains a servers, which is an array. And you can see that we have all of the information here nicely printed out. So we know that our application is running smoothly. So let's test the other functionalities. So I'm gonna duplicate this, and we want to go to get, and we have ID 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can grab any one of those. So I'm gonna do / and then pass, let's say 2. And this is also a get request. So this is gonna return 1 server where the ID is 2. So let's go ahead and send this request. You can see that I got a beautiful response again, and we got the server with ID 2 inside of our data, and the server is an object. So let's go ahead and test the save. So I'm gonna copy this object and open a new tab or duplicate that one and go to the body. That's going to be raw, and we need JSON, and it's going to be a post request, and it's going to go to server.save, and we want to paste this in there. Gonna make this a little bigger. We don't need to send the ID, so I'm gonna go ahead and delete the ID, and let's change this to, let's say 195, and let's say this is Ubuntu, and let's say this is 32 gig, and let's say this is not a Dell Tower, let's say this is a Lenovo, so Lenovo, and we can change the image. Let's say we're gonna pass in the, well, we don't even need to put the image because it's gonna be added on the fly. So if we send this request, this server should be created. So let's go ahead and send this request. And you can see we got the 201 created. This server is created. You can see that we get the image by default, which is the server 3, and then everything looks good. So now if we go back to the get, list everything again, we should see that one at the bottom. As you can see, it's right here. So everything seems to be working. So one thing I want to test is the image URL. So this image URL here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it, and it's going to take me to this new tab where I can actually send the request. So let's go ahead and send this request and make sure this is working. All right, so we got an error. So server, internal server error. So let's take a look at the backend and let's see what we have in the run. Scroll up, go to the bottom. And let's see here. So we have a mistake, as you can see here in our string. So it tries to go to this location, but we need a / here or a / since this is Windows. And so user home. So after the user home, we need a / here. So that was the mistake. So I'm going to put a / here, and I'm going to restart the application, and I'm going to open the run console, make sure this looks good. All right, so everything looks good. So let's go back to Postman again, and let's go ahead and send this request. And you can see that we get the image. So you can see the image is right here. And I can change these to, let's say, 1, send it, get a different image, change it to 2, send it, get a different image. Now, the other thing that I want to test is the ping. So I'm going to duplicate this tab one more time and go to ping. And then we need to pass in the IP address. So let's go back to the list. And so let's resend this get request so that we can get fresh data. And let's say I'm going to see if I can ping that one because I think it's going to be a success. I think this is an actual server or computer on my network. And then here, I'm going to pass in the IP address. This is also a get request. So make sure the method on the request is get. And let's go ahead and send this request. So I'm going to go ahead and send it. And you can see it says ping success. And then we get the server back. And then we can see the status is up. So even if the status was down, after we ping it successfully, the server status is going to be up. So let's see if we can try one that doesn't work. So let's scroll down. I think that last one should give us an error because I don't think I have this IP address. So I'm going to change this IP address and send the request again. And again, you can see ping fail, and then we get the server back. And you can see the status is server down. So everything seems to be working properly, and you can go ahead and test all the other functionalities. Everything should be working as expected. Use your Postman or whatever your HTTP client is, and you can send requests and everything should work as expected. So at this point, the backend is ready and up and running. So we can go ahead and start working on the front end. And again, if you have any question, just reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you. I really went through this really fast. So if you have questions or something is not clear, so make sure you reach out to me and I'll be happy to help. We might have to come back to this if we see that something is not the way that we want it to be. But at this point, I'm satisfied with this work. And from this point on, we're going to be working on the front end. And like I mentioned before, for the front end, we're going to be using Angular, but I might do another video where I show you how to do the same thing, but using RxJs instead, because the same backend can be used with any framework or even vanilla JavaScript. You can use the fetch to send requests to the backend. So the front end is going to be Angular, and that's what we're going to be working on. What we're going to need for the front end is Node.js. So if you go to nodejs.org, you should be presented with a page like this, and you can either download either version. And the reason we need Node.js is because we need the Node package manager so that we can install the Angular CLI. So I have the Angular CLI open, and you can see the command right here. It's npm I for install, and then @angular/CLI. And the Angular CLI is a command line interface, and you can use it to manage Angular applications. So create application, deploy, build, all the fancy stuff that you can do now with command line interface. So go ahead and download any versions of Node.js that you see on here. It doesn't really matter because we're not really going to be using Node.js per se. And then once you have Node.js installed, go ahead and install the Angular CLI by just running this command. And after you do that, you should be ready to go. I mean, assuming you don't get no errors or anything. So now I'm going to create the Angular application. So I'm going to open my terminal and I'm going to bring it up here. So this is my terminal. You can use any terminal you want. Doesn't really matter. And we're going to create the Angular application. And to do this, we're going to do ng. So after you install the Angular CLI, you have access to this command, which is ng. So this is like how you invoke the Angular CLI, and then you can pass in commands, and then it's just going to do things for you, help you manage your application, create the application, run it, deploy it, etc. And to create an application, all you have to do is ng new, and then you pass in the name of the application. So in this case, I'm going to call it server app. The backend is called server, the front end is called server app, just to make the difference between the backend and the front end. And then I'm going to press enter, and I think I have to answer some questions here. I'm going to say yes on that. Would you like to add Angular routing? So this is a single page application, and by this I mean we're not going to have any different route. It's always going to be one page. So I'm going to say end to this for no. And it's asking if I want CSS, Sass, or SCSS for my styling. I'm going to stick with CSS. And it's going to go ahead and create the application for me. As you can see, it's installing all the packages that I want. So I'm going to let this finish, and then I'm going to come back. Everything is installed. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to that folder. So server app, and I'm going to clear the screen. And what I want to do is open this with Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to type code dot to specify this folder, and then Visual Studio Code is going to open in that specific folder. So I'm going to press enter, and it opened in my other screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab it over and open it up. So you should be presented with a screen like this. And all the files and folders are going to be on your left on your panel here. As you can see, everything is populated. Everything has been created. So there's one thing I want to say before I actually start doing anything. So for the front end, I'm going to be using a more advanced technique, and I'm going to take a reactive approach. So we're not going to have a procedural way of doing things like when you define the functions and things like that, and then you call the function and then you wait for a response. Well, per se, we're going to kind of do that, but it's going to be more reactive than anything else. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what that means in a second. And I'm going to show you the example where we have a procedural way and when we have a reactive way, and you're going to see the difference and also see the benefits of using the reactive ways. It's going to be a little bit more advanced, but there's a lot of benefits for using a reactive approach in Angular than using a procedural approach. If we inspect the package.json, for example, and we scroll down a little bit and all the dependencies, you're going to see that we have RxJs here. So by default, the Angular application that you get from using the Angular CLI, it comes bundled with the RxJs library, which means that whoever created this framework, they intended for the developers to use this library in their development. And we're really going to be making extensive use of this library so that we can create the reactive approach that we want to do in this application. And you're going to see how this is going to be different from what you've been seeing. And you can also see the benefits for creating your Angular application that way. So I don't want to say it's better than the procedural approach, because they all have their benefits and disadvantages, but that's just going to give you a different perspective when you're building your Angular application. So really pay attention to what I'm going to be doing here, and if you have any questions, of course, reach out to me. I'll be glad to help you. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is gonna go ahead and close this and expand the source folder, go inside the app folder, and in this folder I want to create another folder. So I'm gonna do new folder, and then I'm gonna name it enum. So I'm gonna put all of the enums that I'm gonna be creating inside of this folder. So I'm gonna right click and do new file, and I'm gonna call this status.enum.ts. So I'm going to create the status that we created in the backend so that we can map it in the front end right here. So I'm going to do export, and this is an enum. I'm going to say status and open and close curly braces. And I'm gonna press Ctrl B so that I can close the panel. And for the enum, I want the all. So you remember in the beginning when I gave you the demo, you saw that you can filter everything by all. We don't have that in the back end, but we do have it in the front end, because I want to give the user the ability to select all and then view all the statuses for all the servers. And I'm gonna set this equal to a string. That's gonna be the same thing. So that's gonna be the first enum. The second one is going to be server up. So exactly what we have in the back end. So I'm gonna do server up, and I'm gonna go ahead and set it equal to the same string. So I'm going to do server underscore up. And then lastly, we have server down. So I'm going to do server underscore down. Again, set it equal to the same string. So this is going to represent the status that we're going to be working with for the servers. So that's one enum that I'm going to need. And then I'm going to go back to the app folder. So in the same app folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it interface. And inside of this interface folder, I want to create the server so that I can map that server as well. So I'm going to do new file, and then I'm going to do server.ts, and I'm going to do export interface, and this is the server, put in close curly braces. And remember, we have an ID, which is a number. We're also going to have an IP address. So IP address, which is a string. And then we have the name, which is also a string. And then we have the memory, so memory, also another string. And we have the type, so type, also another string. The image URL, so image URL, also another string. And then lastly, we had the status, so that's the status. and we're going to give it a type of status. So the same status that we just defined as the enum, that's going to be this status. And you can see that it's auto imported up here. So this is the interface for the server. So whenever we are mapping everything to the front end, so when we make a request to the back end, we get the response to the front end. So that this application will be able to map the servers or the list of the servers into this interface right here. So that is what I need to do for this server. Now I'm going to close this, and then I'm going to go back to the enum, and I'm going to create another file, and I'm going to call this file data-state.enum.ts. So this is going to represent the state of the application. And this is probably not going to be making a lot of sense right now, but this is going to make sense later. So just bear with me. So what I want to do again is just export this. So I'm going to say export enum, and this is going to be the data state. So this is going to represent the data state of the application. And the state that I want to have, they are loading, and I'm going to set it equal to another string that's exactly the same thing. So we're going to say loading. So this is going to represent the application when it's in loading state. I'm going to press Ctrl B again to collapse this panel, and then I want the loaded state. So I'm going to say loaded and set this equal to the same string. And then lastly, I'm going to have an error state. So error, and I'm also going to set it equal to the same string. And the reason I'm setting these to the string is because I don't want to deal with the indices, because whenever you have an enum, by default, TypeScript is going to assign an index to this. So for the value for the loading, it's going to be 0, and then that's going to be 1, and then 2. And I don't want to deal with the indices or the numbers. And I'm also going to be showing this to the UI. So I don't want to show 0 or 1 or 2. I want to show an actual string that makes sense to humans. So I'm changing those, and then, add the value directly as the same as the enum. So this is going to represent the state of our data. And let's go ahead and go back to the interface folder, create another file, and this is going to be the custom issue response. So I'm going to say custom-response.ts and Ctrl B again to collapse this, and I'm going to do export interface custom response. So remember, we create this response in the back end. We also need to map that in the front end. So that's what I'm creating here. And we have a timestamp, and that is a date. And we have a status code. So status code, which is a number. And then we have the status, which in this case is going to be a string. And then we have the reason, also a string. And then we have the message, also another string. And we have the developer message, also another string. And then in the back end, we have a map that's going to represent the data. So here I'm going to say data, and then I'm going to give it a type of an object. So I'm going to do open and close curly braces. And inside of that data, we can have either servers, which is going to be an array of server. So I'm going to say server array. And it can also contain just one server whenever we're returning like one server. So if we call the get on the backend and then we pass in the ID, that's going to return one server. So here I can say server and also give it a type of server. And I need to import those. So quick fix, import from our file. And another thing I want to do is to make these optional, because we know that we're never going to get both of them at the same time. So I'm going to go here and put a question mark, and also go here and put another question mark. So this is how we tell TypeScript that this is optional. So it's possible that we may not have this value inside of this data object. I'm going to go ahead and put a semicolon, and this is all we have to do for this interface. So there's one last thing that I want to do, and then we're going to start working on our service. So inside of the interface folder, I want to represent the entire state of the application. So like I said, we're going to take a reactive approach, and this is all going to make sense later. So I'm going to create another file, and then I'm going to call it app-state.ts. So this is going to represent the entire state of the application. So we're going to capture the entire state of the app at any given moment inside of this state interface here. So I'm going to collapse this again with Ctrl B, and then I'm going to do another export interface, and this is going to be the app state. So app state, and open and close curly braces. And what I want to have in there is the data state, because I want to know the state of the data. And of course, it's going to be of type data state. So that's our enum. And then we need also to grab the data. So I'm going to say app data. You can name this data, doesn't really matter. I want to make this generic. So to do this, I'm going to go up here and put the diamond and then pass in the type here. So I'm going to pass T and then say whatever type is passed up here is the type that this data is going to be. And again, this didn't have to be T, this can be any letter. As long as you use the same letter inside of the class, then that should work just fine. And then lastly, I want an error. If we get an error, and then this is going to be a string. So remember, we can't get the data and then get an error at the same time. So we can either get an error or we get the data. So what that means is that I'm going to have to make this optional. So I'm going to come up here again, put a question mark, go down here, put another question mark. So these two values inside of the interface, they're optional because we know that we're not going to have both of them at the same time. So we can either have this or have this other one. So the application state is going to have some sort of data. And whenever we're using this interface, we're going to have to pass in that type here, which is going to be the type of the application data. And this application data is going to contain all of the data of the application. The data state is going to determine the state of the application. So at any given moment, we can call on this data state and it's going to tell us in what state the application is. We can either be in the loading state, and the loaded state, or in the error state. And since this is the data state, so we know that our data is loading, or it's loaded, or it's an error. So all this information is going to be captured inside of the application state, which is going to represent, like I said, the entire application state at any given moment. And another thing I want to do now that I'm remembering is to make this loading state so that it can make more sense. So I'm going to go up here and do underscore and then do state. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it in all of them. So I'm going to go here, paste it, go here and paste it here, and then paste it in that last one. So loading state, loaded state, and then error state. All right, so we have the application state ready, and now we can start making call to the backend and see how we can map the response to this application state, which is what we're going to be using to manipulate the UI. So let's go back to the folder and let's collapse this for now, and I can actually close all this. And inside of the app folder again, so inside of the main app folder, I'm going to create another folder and I'm going to call it service. And by the way, you can create interfaces and enum with the Angular CLI as well. And you can also create service with the Angular CLI. And I can quickly show you an example. So I'm going to bring up my terminal. And inside of the application, which is where I am right now, as you can see, I can do ng generate or ngg for short. And then I'm going to say service. And I want this to go inside of the service folder that I just created. So I'm going to type service and then I'm going to name it server. So that's going to be the server service. So that's the file that we're going to use to make HTTP requests to the backend. And then I'm going to press enter. I'm going to click yes on that. And you can see that the Angular CLI created two files for me, the server service.ts and also the server service.spec.ts, which is a test file. So I'm going to minimize this for now. And if you go inside of that folder now, you can see that we have those two files. So I'm going to delete the test file because we're not going to be writing tests in this course. So if I open this file now, you can see that the Angular CLI stubbed out the code for me. So I'm going to collapse this again and just clean this up a little bit. Just move this over. You don't have to do this. It's just a preference that I have. And inside of this class, we're going to create all the functions that we need to make HTTP requests. And before we can make HTTP requests in Angular, we need to do some setup. So let's go and let me show you how you can do this. So inside of the app module, we need to bring in the HTTP client module. So we're going to put a comma and then do HTTP client module and make sure this is imported on top. So it's supposed to come from an Angular command HTTP. So that's the HTTP client module. So we don't need to do anything else here. I'm going to go ahead and collapse this again. And then now we can inject the HTTP client in the constructor for this class. So that's similar to dependency injection. Well, it is dependency injection. So we're going to say private. I'm going to call it HTTP. And then we're going to give it a type of HTTP client. So I'm going to say HTTP client, which is coming up here. So now we have the HTTP client injected inside of the server service. We can use this client to make HTTP call to the backend so that we can retrieve data and then map this data to our application state that we just created earlier right here, this application state. So let's go ahead and go back and close this. So the first thing we need to do is to define a method to retrieve all of the servers. So let me show you an example of what you would usually see, which is the procedural approach. So we can have like get servers as the function name, and then it's not going to take any parameter and it's going to return unobservable. So observable, and that's going to be of type custom response. So that's the response that we created. You can see that's coming from our interface, and then open and close curly braces. And inside of there, we would return this.http, and then we would access the get and then pass in the HTTP URL inside of this get method. And we could do something like http://localhost, and we're running on 8080, and you would go to /server/list. Okay, so that would give you the list of all of the, or an array of all of the servers that we have in the backend. And we also have to type this as well. So I'm going to copy this and pass the type down here so that we can get rid of this error, and then end this with a semicolon. So this is the typical way that you would actually make requests to the backend, and that's more of a procedural approach, which is totally fine. There is nothing wrong with this, but I just want to show you a different way of doing things. And to do this, I'm going to be taking a more reactive approach. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that altogether. And what I want to do is to define an observable, and I'm just going to call it servers. So when you're defining observables, it's a good practice to put $sign in the end, and that's how you denote an observable. So the servers is going to be observable. It's going to return a list of servers. And then I'm going to set it equal to this .http.get. Of course, we're going to type it. So we're going to say this is of type custom response, and then we're going to pass in the URL. So here I'm going to say, let's say I'm going to define some variable in this class. So I'm going to use template literal, and I'm going to say this.api URL, and let's go ahead and define this right now. Quick fix declare. So this is going to be some kind of string, so we can leave it like this for now. And while we're here, let's just make this private and read only, and then declare it just like that. Let's just set it equal to the string so that we don't get any errors. And then we want to go to /server/list. Okay, so this is going to return the list of all the servers, and you can see I'm directly assigning this variable to this observable, which in turn make this variable an observable as well. And then I'm going to do that and then call the pipe operator, and inside of the pipe operator I want to do two things. So I'm going to go ahead and log what we got. So I'm going to call the tap, which is another operator, and then use the console.log. So we're going to log the response onto the console, and then I can use the catch error. So I'm going to say catch error, which is another operator, and then I can call a method. So let's say this handle errors. Okay, so we don't have this method yet, and we're gonna go ahead and create it right now. So I'm gonna click on here, quick fix. This is a method, so I'm gonna declare it at the bottom. It's on top, so I'm just gonna cut it up from up here and go down and then paste it. So handle error. Let's just remove all this junk right here. And this is going to return an observable of never, and we can just return this guy right here. So we're going to say return, and we're going to call the throw error instead. So throw error, and you can see it's coming from RxJs as well. And I can just pass this string for now. Remove all this, and we need to make this an observable. So let's go here, do observable, and everything looks good. So this is the handle error function. We also have to import the catch error, quick fix. This is not what I want. These are coming from RxJs, so I'm gonna have to do this manually. So let's go and scroll up, and the throw error is coming from RxJs, and I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate this line, and we want things to come from RxJs/operator. So operators right here, and what we're looking for is the tap. So I'm gonna copy this and paste it here, and also the catch error, and then paste it here. All right, so now all of our errors should go away. So this is how I'm going to define this observable. We're going to go ahead and make the call, pipe the response. We're going to log it to the console so that we can see it. And then we're going to catch any errors that's going to be processed by this method right here. So this is our observable. And I see that it's giving me the type of any, and I don't want that. So let's go ahead and just copy this. I can actually copy all this. And I'm just going to go ahead and cast it. So I'm going to put it in front of this and change this to a custom HTTP response. And then put this on a new line. And since we're casting all of this, so we need to enclose this in the diamond. So I'm gonna do, open and close, and then copy all this, or cut it rather, and then paste it in here. So now if I hover over servers, you're gonna see that it's returning an observable of type custom HTTP response. So this is the observable that we're gonna be using in the component so that we can retrieve a list of all the servers. So now I can just copy this and then go down and then paste it. And this is going to be the save. So I'm going to say save. So that's saving a server. All of these look good, but the only difference is we're going to go to save, and this is going to be a post instead of a get. So we're going to say post. And now we need to pass in the request body because it's a post request. So we're going to make this observable take the server. So we're going to go up here, open and close parentheses, and we're going to say this is going to take a server, which is going to be of type server. And then put the arrow function here. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with arrow function, but these are technically arrow functions. And then here we can pass in this body. So we're going to say server. And everything else is going to be the same. The only difference is this observable takes a parameter, which is the server, which is of type server. And we pass it here as the request body whenever we call server.save. This is going to be the body of the request. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy this again. Gonna go down, paste it. This is going to be the ping. So I'm going to change this to ping. And this is going to take the IP address. So I'm going to say IP address. And this time this is going to be a string. So I'm going to pass in the string. Change the method to a get, and we don't need the body anymore. And this is going to go to ping. So we're going to pass in ping. And then we need to pass in the IP address as part of the URL. So we're going to do the same thing again, since we're using template literal, and then pass in the IP address. And I'm going to copy this one more time, scroll down, paste it. This is going to be the delete. So I'm going to say delete, and we need the server ID. So server ID, which in this case is going to be a number, and pass in the server ID as part of the URL as well. And this is going to go to delete. So change the ping to delete, and this is the delete request. All right. So let's go ahead and work on this method down there. The first thing I want to do is to make it private because it's supposed to only be used inside of this class, and then console log that. So I'm going to say console.log and then pass in the error. Let's see what is this called. Let's call this error, and this is going to be of type HTTP error response. So we can type this properly, and then I'm going to copy this and then paste it. So this is going to be for our debugging purposes whenever we're debugging this application or running it, so that we can see the error in the console if something happens. And I'm going to remove this extra space here, and we can pass in any message that we want here. So I'm going to say an error occurred, for example, and then pass in the status code. So I'm going to do dash error code and then pass in the error code. So $, open and close curly braces, error that there's supposed to be a status on this. So error.status. So we can actually make this a lot more refined, because right now I'm not really using all this stuff that I'm getting from the backend because I don't really want to focus on this too much. And the last function that we need inside of this class is the filter function. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this delete again, and I'm going to put it before the delete, and we're going to call this filter. So filter, what this is going to take is the status. So we're going to say status. So the status by which the user want to filter the servers by. So this is going to be of type status. So that's coming from our enum. And we also need the response. So whatever the current response is, or whatever the current data is, we need to access that. And I'm going to give this the type of custom response. And we're not going to be calling the backend to filter the nodes, because why would we do that if we already have everything right here in the front end already? So we're not going to do this line right here. And instead, we're going to create a new observable, because we have to make this return observable. So I'm going to say new observable, and we can also give it the type. So that's going to be of type custom HTTP response, and then open and close parentheses. And what we need is the subscriber. So we're going to give this any name that we want. Usually you would see that it's called subscriber, and then call the callback function. And the first thing I want to do is to maybe like console log that so that we can see what we get. So I'm going to console log the response. And then the only thing I have to do is to call the subscriber and then call the next function on this. So the next function or method, it's just going to emit something to the observable. So whoever is subscribed to this observable, they would get this new value. In that case, since we said that it's going to be a custom HTTP response, then whatever we have to next on here, it's supposed to be the custom HTTP response. So I'm going to do open and close parentheses. And what we have to do is to check to see what the status is. So if the status that we got from the function, if this is all, so we're going to put 3 equal signs and then check the status that all, we're going to put a question mark. So if this is the case, we can just return the response, because we don't need to filter anything because the user chose all. So that means they want to see all the servers. We don't need to do any filtering or anything like that. So I'm going to create a new object, and I'm going to get everything that I already got from the response. So using the spread operator, so I'm going to do response. And the only thing that I want to override on the response is the message. So I'm going to say message, and then we want to set this to some message. And if you remember from the demo, we pass in something like servers filtered by, and then we can pass in the status. So $, open and close, and then whatever status that they pass, which in this case is going to be all, and then we're going to say status. and I'm gonna scroll over a little bit, and here I'm gonna put a colon. So in case this is not the case, so in case the status is not all, then we need to filter everything and then return a different object to the users. In the first case where everything is all, we're returning this object, so everything that we already got, so the same data that we got in the response, and we're overriding just the message. So if this is not the case, then we need to return a different object. So I'm gonna put open and close curly braces again. I want to spread everything in the response again, so I'm gonna say response, and I need to override the message again. So the message is going to be similar. We're going to say, you know, server have been filtered by whatever status. And the way that I'm going to do this is by checking to see after I filter all of the servers, do I actually have anything? So if I filter the servers and it's 0, so let's say the user choose servers down, and currently we don't have any servers down. So I have to say something like there's no server, because it wouldn't make sense to say, you know, server filtered by down status because there's no servers. So I'm going to go inside of the response and inside of the data, and I want to access all the servers. And then I can call the filter because this is an array. And I want to say for every server that I get, call the callback function, and then check to see if the server that status equal to the actual status. So status. So that's the status that we're getting from the function from up here. And then I can check to see if I have anything in this array. So I can call the length and then check to see if it's greater than 0. So greater than 0, and then put a question mark. So that is similar to what we're doing here. So we're saying if when we filter all the servers, which is what we're doing in here, when we say response, data, servers, and then filter all the servers by that status. So whatever status we got, if the length of this array after we filter it, if it's bigger than 0, then our message is going to be something. So I can put string literal, and then I'm going to pass in the message, and I'm going to put this on a new line so you guys can see it. So I'm going to copy all this line and then paste it here. And then I'm going to say server filtered by whatever the status is, and then status. So there's another thing. If I go inside of this enum, you can see that the status is going to be like server underscore up and then server underscore down. So I don't want to have that here. I want to have something like server up and server down. So I can do the same thing again inside of this string literal. So I'm going to put this on a new line, and instead of saying servers filtered by whatever the status is, so that's going to be status underscore up status, and I don't want that. So I can check to see if this is the status up. So I can do status dot server up and then put a question mark again. So if this is the case, then the string is going to be server up. So I get rid of the underscore. Otherwise, it's going to be a different string. So I'm going to do server down because I only have 2 different options. So the first case of all will be cut here. And then here, I know it can only be server up or server down. So remember, we're still inside of this first one. So here now I can put another colon and then return another string. So that's the case where we don't have any servers after we filter everything. So now we can say something like no servers of, and then pass the status again, status, and then we can say something like found. This is going to be our message, and this is going to go off the screen. I'm going to put this again on a new line so that you guys can see it. And then the last thing I want to override is the data, because that's the actual data that we have to return. So I'm going to say data, and remember this is an object. So I'm going to put open and close curly braces. And also let me get rid of this error because we don't need this question mark here. And now it's telling us that this can be undefined, and I'm going to show you how to fix this in a minute. And for the data, we're pretty much going to do just this. The key again is going to be servers. As you can see, everything is coming up because we typed everything. And then we're going to set it equal to this guy right here. So we're going to just copy this and then paste it here. So this can be a little bit confusing, so make sure you really go over this multiple times, because I understand that this can be a lot to take in all of a sudden. We have 2 errors here, and I'm going to tell you why. This is telling us that this can be possibly undefined, and that's because we have a configuration in this application, and I'm going to show you how to manage this properly. And remember, we're still inside of the next, which is going to either return this object or this other object to the caller of this observable. But after we call next on the subscriber so that we can emit something to whoever is subscribing to the observable, we also have to complete the observable. And this is how we signal that we have finished with what we were doing. So we're going to call this subscriber again and then call complete. So that's how we tell the subscribers, okay, we're done emitting whatever we're emitting, we have completed as an observable. And again, like I said, this is quite a lot, and there are many different ways we can do this. We can use if statements instead, we can use switch, but I found this to be a little bit more interesting. And I really have no idea how to put this, in terms of lines so that you can really see it clearly. If I put it on one line, it's going to go off the screen. So make sure you can copy this and paste it somewhere else. Just take a look at it, put it on one line and check everything. Make sure you understand what's what's going on here. But this entire block is just for the message. And just so you guys understand, I'm going to go over it one more time. So what we're doing is trying to filter all the servers by specific status. So what we're getting in terms of what parameters this observable is taking is the status they want to filter by in the data, so the entire HTTP response. And what we're doing here is we're creating this new observable. Okay, so you can see that this is a new observable. We give it a type, and then for the callback function, which takes a subscriber, so we're naming this subscriber, we're gonna either return this object, so you can see the beginning and the closing all the way down here. And what we're doing is we're console logging the response so that we can see what we have, and then we call next, which is how we emit a new value to whoever is subscribed to this observable. And then the first thing we do for the object that we're going to return, we're going to check to see if the status is all, which is what we're doing here. If this is the case, then we're going to return this response. So this is the object that we're going to return, all that. So we're going to spread everything that we already have in the response and override the message property inside of the response object or the custom HTTP response object up here. Otherwise, which means if the status is not all, then we have to filter the servers. So we're going to put this colon for the or because we have a question mark here. And then we're going to spread everything in the response again. And we're going to try to override the message and the data that we have to filter. So the message is going to be, we're going to filter all the servers, which is what's happening here, what is highlighted. And if the length of this array after we filter everything, because when you call the filter, it's going to filter the array based on this condition. So if after we check, we see that the length of the array is greater than 0, then we're going to pass in this as the message, which is going to be all that. And here we're doing something similar again inside of the message. So we're going to say server filtered by, and then the status, which is going to be all this, is going to be either server up or server down, depending on the status. So if the status that they pass is server up, the string is going to be server up. So it's going to be servers filtered by server up status. Otherwise, it's going to be server down. So that is just for the message. But in case that we didn't find any server after we filter the server by the status, then the message is going to be no servers of whatever the status is found. So this is all for the message. And then remember, the most important thing is the data. So that's the servers that we have to filter and return to the user. And that's what we're doing here. So we're going to say for the data, which is an object. How do we know it's an object? If we go inside of here, the data, remember, it's an object, and we just have to filter these servers. So inside of here, we're going to say for the servers, we're just going to get the response. So whatever we got from the caller of this function, grab the data, which is going to be this data, and then access the servers. You can see here for the servers, we're just going to go ahead and filter everything by whatever status that they pass up here by just using the same filter array method. And now for those errors, so if I overrun this, it say this can be passively undefined. And that's because we have some configuration inside of the TypeScript configuration file. So I'm going to show you where this is. So if you scroll down and you go inside of the tsconfig and collapse this strict true, it's for a bunch of configuration that we're turning true here. And I can show you real quick. If I go ahead and turn this to false and go back and just wait for a couple seconds, you can see that the error is gone. But you shouldn't do this because this is important for good development. You don't want to turn this entire thing off. And I'm going to go ahead and show you exactly what this is doing. So let's go back to the browser. And I have the page for TypeScript Lang, and you can see the strict for the configuration. It's going to turn all these things on. Okay, so it's going to always check for strict null checks. So it's really enforcing a lot of things for us by just turning this to true. So for now, I'm going to turn it to false, which is not recommended. And then I'm going to go through this and see which one that I want to turn on and which one that I want to turn off, because you really don't want to turn all of these off, because it's really good for your development so that people don't make mistakes and make things undefined and null when they're not supposed to. But I don't want to deal with this right now. So I'll go ahead and, turn on the ones that I want to be turned on and then turn off the ones that I don't want. So let's go back to the code, and we're going to keep it at false for now and then go back to the application. So I hope that makes sense. And again, if something is not clear, go ahead and reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you. And also one last thing, you can see that we're also piping all of this the same way that we're doing for the HTTP call that we're making. And remember, these HTTP functions, they return an observable, and you can go inside of them and you're going to see that it's returning an observable of whatever type that you pass it. So these are returning observables. So the same way we are manually creating this observable, so we can call the pipe on this function as well, because it's technically an observable. So if while we're doing this operation, something goes wrong, then we'll also catch it in this exception here. So that's all we'll need to do for this server service. And I'm going to show you how we're going to use all these in the component and then have our application state at any given time in the application, because the application state is going to determine which part of the UI that the user can see at any given moment. And I'm going to say this one more time. This is a lot to take in. So make sure you pause the video, slow it down, or do whatever you need to do, and make sure you understand what this is doing. Our service is now ready, so we can start making use of this service in the component. Let me make sure I have the error. So this is gonna throw an error. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that I actually put some implementation for this function. And also you can make this function a lot more robust. Like you can put if statements and check for whatever you want to check. But in my case, I'm just gonna throw, this code right here, and then I'm gonna show the status. But you can also access the message, like the developer message that we set up in the backend. It should be inside of this guy right here. But in this case, I'm just gonna throw this string right here, which is just gonna be a simple string. So let's go back. I'm gonna close these first and then go back to the component. So I'm gonna collapse this interface and service for now and go back into the app component. So this is the main component of our application. And I'm also gonna go ahead and delete the spec file because I'm not gonna use it. Move to recycle bin. What I want to do is to clean this HTML file, delete. And inside of the app component, we're gonna start working on our application in here. So the first thing I want to have is a constructor. So I'm going to define a constructor so that I can do dependency injection, because we need to bring in the service that we just created. And this is going to be the server service. So I'm going to call it server service, and it's going to be of type server service. So server service. So in the constructor for this class, so this app component class, I'm going to collapse this for more room. So inside of this class, we have the server service. So that means we can use all the functions that we just defined in the server service and then get the data that we need. So I'm going to come down here and I need to implement a lifecycle hook called ng on init. So I'm going to do ng on init. And this is not going to take anything. It's going to also return void and open and close curly braces. And for this to work, we need to actually implement an interface, I believe. So implement on init. So because we're implementing this on init, then we're obligated to define this method right here. So what this means is that whenever this component is done initializing, it's going to call this ng on init, and that's going to fire any code that we put inside of this function. And that's exactly what we're looking for, because we want the code to execute once this component is initialized. So remember, I said that we're going to capture the entire state of the application, and that's going to be a variable that I'm going to call app state, and it's going to be an observable. So I'm going to put the $sign at the end. And then I'm going to give it a type of observable, and that's going to be an observable of type app state. So we're going to call the app state interface that we define. Remember, this is a generic, so we need to pass it the type of data that we're going to have in the state. So the type of data is going to be the custom response. So I'm going to say custom response. So also from our interface, and that's going to be our type. So the entire application state is going to be inside of this observable or this variable, and the type of it is an observable. And then we pass in the type for that observable, which is the entire application state. And the data that we're going to manage is the custom HTTP response. So remember, the app state is generic, so we have to pass the type of data we want in the application state. So for this state right there, and then we pass in the custom HTTP response, which is going to contain all the data of the application at any given moment. Hopefully this is connecting. So what I want to do when the application initializes, I want to set the state of the application. So I'm going to call the application state and then set it equal to the service. So server service. And then I want to call the servers, because this is going to return a list of all the servers in the application. And then what I want to do is to pipe this. So I'm going to call the pipe operator. I want to map any response that I get. So I'm going to call the map. I'm going to say whenever you get a response from the server, right, I want to execute a callback function. And I'm going to put open and close curly braces here because I want to have multiple lines. So if we have a response, we want to return an object, which is going to be of type application state, because remember, we're setting the application state here. So whatever we put inside of this object, it has to be of this type right here. Okay, so let me scroll up a little bit. So what I want to do is to set the data state. So I'm going to say data state. So the data state is gonna be the data state. So I'm gonna say data state, and then we want the loaded state. So that's gonna be the loaded, because at this point we know that we get a response from the server. So our data is loaded. And then we need to set the app data. So we're gonna say app data, and this is gonna be the response that we get. So we're gonna say response, and you can see this is not complaining because this is a valid object to return here because it matches the description of the type that we set up here. So the application state, which is an observable, we're already in an observable because the servers is an observable, and then we're piping the response and map it to this object, which is also the same type of this object that we define up here. This is only going to happen whenever we get the response. So when the application is done initializing, then it calls this ng on init. Then it's going to say, all right, I need to subscribe to this observable. And this observable is going to make an HTTP request. So that means we're not going to have this data right away because we have to wait because it's an HTTP request, which means that we need to give this observable something to begin with. And we're going to use another operator called start with. You can see it coming up here. And then we can give it another object to return while we wait for the data to come back. So what I'm going to do is to just copy all this and then paste it in here. All right. So what I'm doing here is saying, okay, so we're going to subscribe to this observable, which is going to make an HTTP request that we, as the developer, we know that this is going to take some time. So while this is going on, so while we're making the request to the backend, we're going to return this object to this observable. And at this point, our data is not loaded. So our data is loading. So we're going to select the loading state. And also remember, I made the data optional. So if you go back to the application state, the app data is optional. So that means we don't have to pass it because we know that at this point in the application, while we're waiting for the HTTP request to complete, we don't have any data yet. You could do something like this. You could say null. That would work as well, but I can just omit it altogether because it's optional. I don't have to pass it. So I'm just going to say, okay, at this point, my application state, for the data state, it's loading. And then one last thing I need to do is to catch any errors that occurs in the application. And for this, I'm going to use the catch error again. So I'm going to do catch error, which is coming also from the operators. And this is going to take the error. So I'm going to say this is going to be the error. And we know that this is going to be a string. So if I go back real quick to the service, I'm just going to click here to go to the service. Remember, whenever we get an error, so for any of these functions, whenever we get an error, which is going to go to the catch error, it's going to call this function and pass the error to it, which is what we're catching down there. And all we're doing is we're throwing the error by just sending this string. Okay, so that's a simple string. We could send an object, we could send something really complex, but in my case, I'm just sending this simple string. So this string is gonna be the error that we're catching here, which is why I'm giving it the type of string, because I know for sure that it's going to be a string every single time. And then what I wanna do is to just call the callback function. And what I want to do here is to return another observable. So I'm going to do return of, which is another operator from RxJs that you can use to create an observable on the fly. And in here, I'm going to pass in another object. Remember, every object that we pass, it has to be of this type. So the type that we define up here, which is what this is expecting, because we set this equal to this entire thing. So whatever we put inside of this guy, it has to match this data type right here. So I can just copy the same object in here, and then go down here and then paste it. But this time it's not gonna be loaded, it's gonna be the error state. So I'm gonna select the error state because we get an error, and then I can pass the error as well. So you can do something like this. So error is gonna become error, because remember, if we go back one more time into the app state, we call this property error. So another thing we can do, since we name this error and this is also error as well, we can just pass in one of them because they have the same name. So JavaScript will be able to do the work and say like, okay, for the error, it's gonna be this error right here. So we can just keep it that way. And you can see now everything looks good. We don't have any errors in the application because we're setting our state correctly. So we can subscribe to this observable, and at any given moment, it's either gonna say, all right, we get some data, or it's gonna say the data is loaded, or we're gonna get an error. And the way we're gonna subscribe to this observable is in the UI by using the async pipe. So that's gonna make everything really easy for us. Whenever the application initializes, it's gonna go through this, and then it's gonna say, all right, I don't have the response yet, so I'm just gonna start with this So we can say, hey, application is in loading state. And then once we get some data, then it's going to return this state. Or if we get an error for some reason, then we know we're going to get this error state, and then we're going to get an error message that we can show to the user. So this is a reactive approach instead of, subscribing here in the component and things like that. So that's another way you can write your Angular code. And there's really a lot of benefits for writing your code this way. So before I continue with the other functions that I need for this front-end application, I want to show you what this application state looks like so that you can have a better understanding of what we're doing here. So I'm going to see if I can spin up the backend and then run the front end, and then see if I can show you what this application state looks like, to help you visualize things a little better. So I'm going to go ahead and format this a little bit, and I need to go inside of the service. So let's go inside of the service. We need to set this URL. So that's going to be http://localhost, and this is running on port 8080, and this is going to be the base URL. So just the domain and then the port, because we're going to /server/list/server, etc. So we could also make this /server as the base URL, but that should work fine. So we have the URL in, so that's going to be our backend URL. So now we just have to run the backend. So let's open the backend application. And there's one thing I want to do in the backend application. So if we try to run this backend and try to access it with the Angular application, we're going to get a course error because the domains are not the same. And if you don't know what the course error is, you can go ahead and Google that. But this is something you're going to encounter when you have two applications running and you want them to communicate through the browser and they're not on the same domain. So there's something that is set up in the browser for security purposes that's going to stop this from happening unless the backend server explicitly specify that this front-end application can access it. Then the browser is going to give you this course error. So I'm going to go to the main application class because I need to define a bean, and I'm just going to copy and paste it because every time it's going to be the same code anyway. So I'm just going to copy it from my screen and then just go and paste it anywhere here. I'm just going to paste it below this method right there. All right, so everything is imported and everything looks good. So this is just a course configuration. I'm just saying, hey, allow this domain, allow these headers and things like that. And you can take a look at this if you want, but I usually have this code somewhere. And whenever I'm building the backend application, I just add this bean just to make sure that I don't have any course error. And you can see that I have 4200 here for my localhost and 3000. That's because sometimes I'm working with Angular applications and sometimes I'm working with RxJs application in the front end. So I make sure I include, the 3000, which is the default port on localhost when you're working with RxJs application. So that's all we have to do for the backend. And I'm just going to go ahead and run this. We shouldn't have any problem. We should have those servers in the database, so we will have something to show as part of our data. So the backend is up and running. As you can see here, everything is successful. So now let's go back to the front-end application. All right, and everything looks good. And let's go back to the component and everything looks good. So what we need to do is to subscribe to this observable and then read the data in the UI right there. So in the HTML template. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a div. So I'm going to say div, press space, and then I'm going to put double curly braces. And inside of those, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subscribe to the observable, that is the app state. So I'm going to say app state with the $. And then we're going to use the async pipe. So I'm going to do async. And then we also need to show this data in JSON format. So I'm going to add another pipe. That is the JSON pipe. So what this is going to do is with the async pipe, we're going to subscribe to this observable. And then whenever we get the data, we're going to display it in JSON format, as you can see here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring the browser and minimize this as well. And we want to go to localhost 4200. So I already have it copied. So you can see 4200 and let's press enter. And you can see that was really fast. So you can see the data is right there. The data state is loaded and we have the app data, which is the actual data that we want to show. And then we have our custom HTTP response. So all of this information is the HTTP response metadata. So the timestamp, the status code, and the message. And then also we have the data. So you can see the data is right there, which is an object that contains an array of server, which is all of this, as you can see here that I highlighted. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this one more time. And it's really fast. You can't really see when it says the data is in loading state, but that's something that actually happens. And let's see if we can simulate this for a second. So I'm going to go back to the backend and see if I can add a delay just so we can see the different states of the application. So I'm back in the backend and I'm going to minimize this for now, go inside of the resource. So this is the URL that we're calling. And inside of this method, I can put a delay. I can do time. Let's do time unit, and then we can do seconds. and then we're gonna say sleep for, let's say we're gonna make this sleep for 3 seconds. And we need to add an exception to this, add exception. We can remove this later. That is just so I can show you the different states of the front-end application. So let's go ahead and restart, and we're gonna let this come up. Okay, everything looks good. So I'm gonna minimize this again, and now watch the UI and see the different states of the application. So I'm gonna refresh. You can see that we're in loading state, and after 3 seconds, we get the data. So now we're in the loaded state. And of course, if we had an error, it would be in the error state, and we'll get the error message as well. So you can see how powerful using the reactive approach can be. And this is the approach that we're gonna take to build the entire application. The next thing I want to do is to add the UI, because obviously we don't want to keep looking at the data this way. So I'm going to go ahead and add all the HTML markup that we need for the front end, and then I'm going to walk you through it. It should be pretty straightforward. And again, my guess is you guys already know HTML, or at least you know the basics. Nothing is really going to confuse you. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the UI, and then we're going to walk through it a little bit. And then after that, we're going to keep working on our function and the component. So I went ahead and added all of the UI that we needed for this application. And I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of what I did. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and this is the app component. And by the way, I'm using Bootstrap, so everything should be pretty straightforward if you're familiar with Bootstrap. I have the 3 buttons on top. So the button to print the report, the button to add a new server, which is going to point to a modal, so a little pop-up window. And then we have the drop down to select the filters, and then down below I have a simple table, and I'm just gonna show all the servers that we have in this table right there. And then a little bit down I have the modal, so the add server modal. So this is what the button was pointing to. So whenever we click the button, then it's gonna open this little pop-up window, and then we can add in a new server if we want to. And another thing I want to point out that I'm gonna be using for the UI, I'm gonna scroll down and show you. So this ng container is coming from Angular, and it's not a typical HTML tag. So this ng container, if you guys are familiar with RxJs, it's really a React fragment, which means that we're gonna have this in the UI as developer for us to work with, but it's not gonna create any markup in the actual HTML after the code is rendered. And that's what I'm gonna be using so that I can show different pieces of UI depending on the state of the application. So this ng container is gonna allow us to do this. So you can see that I'm putting everything inside of the ng container. And then for this ng container that is highlighted, I'm going to show the spinning. So this is going to be whenever the application is in loading state. And then whenever the application is ready, I'm going to be showing this one, which contains the entire table. And I'm going to collapse this, and I'm going to show you the last one. So this one, this other ng container, which is just a fragment of HTML, is going to contain the error, which we're going to show in case there's an error. And since I'm using Bootstrap, so I have to do some import. So in the index.html, I added the JavaScript that I need for Bootstrap, along with the CSS and some icon here with font awesome. And then inside of the style.css, I added I'm adding the font awesome again. So I'm going to delete one of those. And then I have the Bootstrap CDN. And then I have some custom style that I put in for the UI. So all this code is going to be available. And you know, this is not a UI course, so it's not a CSS HTML. This is more on the backend side and the front end side with Angular. So we're not going to spend too much time on the UI like HTML and CSS stuff. So just make sure you grab all the code, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to make this work, how we're going to show different pieces of UI depending on the state of the application. As you can see right now, we're showing everything. We're showing the loading state by showing the spinner, we're showing the data, and then we're showing the error at the same time. So all we have to do is to switch on these different states and then show different pieces of UI to the user. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So let's go back to VS Code. And you can see that I commented this line out, so we're not going to be using this anymore. And what I want to do is to access the data. So all the data that we need in the application is inside of this app state right here. So this contains the entire state of the application depending on the data state that we have. If the data is loaded, then everything is in there. If we get an error, then we will show the last piece at the bottom. So everything we need is inside of this guy right here. So we just have to subscribe to this observable and then manage the UI depending on the state of the application. You can already see how this is going to be pretty easy. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and this ng container, this first one, it wraps all the other ones. So if I collapse this, just so you can see that inside of this ng container, that's where I have everything. That's where I have the error, that's where I have the table, that's where I have the loading as well. So this has to wrap all the other ng container that you want to show. So inside of this ng container, what I want to do is to check for the state. So I'm going to check with an if statement. So I'm going to do ng if. So if we have any data, I'm going to set this equal to, so I'm going to say the app state. So we're going to access the app state with the $, and then we're going to add the async pipe. Remember, this is how we subscribe to an observable whenever we're in the UI. And I want to give this another name as well. So I'm going to put it in parentheses and then use the as so that I can give it a different name. And then I'm going to call it app state, just so I can get rid of this $ at the very end, because I don't want to keep using this variable name all the way in the template. So I'm subscribing to this observable by using the async pipe, and then I'm giving it a local variable name, which is the app state, as you can see here. Now, if we go back to the component for 1 second, so remember this application state that I'm subscribing to, it's of type observable of app state. So if we go inside of the app state, remember we have the data state, which is the loading, loaded, or error. So what we need to do is to use a switch statement on the data state so that we can check for when the data is loading or loaded, or when we get an error. So let me close that and let's go back. What I want to do is to create a switch statement. So I'm going to add bracket, and then here I'm going to do ng switch, just like that. And then I'm going to set it equal to the data state in the app state. So I'm going to say app state dot data state. So the data state and the app state, remember, that's our enum. That's going to be like loaded, loading, or error. So we're going to be switching on the different states of the application. So all I have to do now, I'm just going to switch to see if inside of the app state, the data state is loading. Then I'm going to show this piece of UI. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to do ng switch case. And then I'm going to set this equal to the loading state. So I'm going to bring in the data state inside of the class so that I can use it here, so that I don't have to type this manually. So let's go back in the component, and right under here, I'm going to put a space so that we can separate the constructor from everything else. And then I'm going to define another variable, which is going to be read only, because I don't need to use it in this class at all. And that's going to be the data state. So we're going to call it data state, and we're going to set it equal to the data state. So we're going to say data state. So that's our enum that we define, and that way we can use it in a component. And of course we can't change it because we make it read only. So I'm just going to copy this name and then go back to the component. So since we're switching on the data state of the app state, and remember, if we go back again inside of the app state, the data state is of type data state. So these two types are the same. So this variable that we just defined here and the data state on the app state, they are the same type, which is the same enum. So that means we can use this variable that we define, which is this data state here, in the UI, so that we can switch on the different data state that we have in the app state. So here I'm going to say data state, and we're looking for the loading. So let's go back real quick. I just need to see what I named these. So it's loading state. So I'm going to copy this, go back, and then paste it here. So we're saying, hey, we're going to subscribe to this observable, and then we're going to switch on the data state. And then we say, well, whenever we have the case of loading, then we're going to show this piece of UI. And of course, you already guessed it, we're going to do the data state loaded on the second one. So whenever the data state is loaded, so on the opening ng container right there, I'm going to add the loaded state. So I'm going to change this to loaded. So whenever the data is loaded, then we're going to show this piece of UI. And then I'm going to do it for the last one, which is going to be the error state. So I'm going to copy this and collapse this. So we have this last ng container where we're checking for errors, and then we're going to show this error right there. So I'm just going to go here and then paste it. And what did we name the error state? We call it error state. So I'm going to copy this and then go back to the UI and then paste it in here. So whenever we have an error state, it's going to show error, and we're going to show the error message here in a second. And whenever we have the loaded state, we're going to show the table and everything. And whenever the data is loading, so we have the loading state, we're going to show the spinner. So now we can go back to the UI and check it out. So let's go back, and now you can see we don't have the spinner anymore, and we don't have the error anymore. And I can show you that real quick since we have a delay in the backends. So if I go ahead and refresh this, you're going to see we have the spinner because we're in the loading state, and then the data is back. Then we have the loaded state. So now we have the data. And you can see now all the other UIs are gone. So that's what we're going to be using to manage the UI. We're going to use the application state itself, and then we're checking on the different states and then show different pieces of UI depending on that state. What I want to show now is all the servers that we have, because we know that the data is loaded. So if you right click and inspect this a little bit, we should see an object, as you can see here, and then we have the data. Inside of it, we have all the servers. So all of our data is in here, as you can see. So we can show all this information on the UI. So I'm gonna go ahead and maybe minimize this a little bit. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And what I need to do is to just loop over all this array and then print all the information, as you can see here, that we need to show to the user. And we're gonna do this in the table body. So what I'm gonna do inside of the body is to just loop over everything. So I'm gonna do an ng4. So we're gonna do ng4 and let's say let server. So we're gonna call every item in the array a server because it's a list of servers. And then we're gonna say of, and then we're gonna call the app state. And then we need to go inside of the app data. That's supposed to be the app data. And then inside of the app data, we have the data. And then inside of the data, which is an object, we have all the servers. And if we want to get the index, we can say let I equal index. So I'm not going to use the index in this case, but I just want to show you, you can get the index as well. So this is how we're going to loop inside of the application state to get all of the servers. So if this is a little bit confusing, I'm going to show you what we're doing. So let's go back to the component. So we're looping over all the servers inside of the application data, which means that this object that we have in the UI is the entire objects that represent the application data. So what we need to do is we need to go inside of the app data, which is of type T. In our case, we're passing in this type, the custom HTTP response. So our data, so our app data in this case is T, which is the custom HTTP response. And if we go inside of that, we have this data object. And inside of this data object is where we have all of our servers. So that's why we have to go through the application state, go inside of the app data, and then go inside of the data, and then go inside of the servers. So we're looping over all the servers. And then at this point, we can just show all this information that we have to show here. So I'm gonna put double curly braces for string interpolation. And then we need to say server dot IP address, and I'm gonna copy this and then highlight this and do double curly braces and then just paste this. So server dot name, and then we're gonna do it again for the memory. We're gonna say memory, and we're also gonna do it for the type. So highlight it, double curly braces, space, paste, and then space again. Just to test this out, let's go back to the browser and see if we have anything. And as you can see, we have all the information here already. So we have all of our information. So let's fill out all the rest of the information so that we can have a working UI. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and add the image. So here, I'm gonna say this is the server.image URL. So image URL, and we can use the property here. So we can say bracket. All right, that should work. And we can do the same for the alt that we have on the image tag. So we're gonna say alt. Also put this inside bracket, and then we're gonna give this the name of the server. So we're gonna say server.name. So in case that we can't load this image, then this is gonna be the name of the server that we're gonna show if for some reason we can't load that image. So now if we go back, we should see all the images are there. So let's go ahead and work on the status. So the status is gonna go in here. So we can copy this right there and then go in this badge and then paste it, and then we're gonna say status. So we're gonna say status just like that. And if we go back, we'll let this load, we're gonna see server up, server down, server up, server down. So what I want to do is I want to show server up or server down, but I don't want to show the underscore. So I'm gonna close this and zoom in a little bit so you guys can see clearly. So we have this underscore, which is the way it is in the backend, because we have server underscore up, server underscore down. But I don't want to show this. I want to show server space up or server space down. I don't want this underscore because I want to make this more user friendly. And also we need to add a different CSS class depending on, the server is up or if the server is down. So let's go ahead and work on that. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and we need to add another class, but dynamically. So I'm going to put a space and then go down. And then I'm going to use ng class. So I'm going to say ng class because we need to add a class dynamically. And then I'm going to put it in bracket. And then I'm going to set it equal to another bracket. And then what I want to do is to check the status of the server. So I'm going to say server. So the server in the loop, check the status. And then I want to see if the status equal the server up. And we can use the same enum that we used for the data state. So let's go back here, and I'm going to do another read only. So read only. And we're gonna say status and set this equal to the status. So that's the enum that we created that's coming from our enum. And just to remind you, if I go inside of this class, that's the enum that we're using inside of the interface that we created for the server. So if we go back again inside of the server, not the service, so in the interface, servers, Remember, we're using this status for the status of the server, so that can be either server up or server down. As you can see here, server up or server down or all, but we're not using this all. We're only using this all in the front end. We're only using server up and server down in the back end. And since they have the same name, you can see that I named them the same in the back end and the front end. So that means I can use this in the front end as well. When I do a comparison, it's not gonna break because I give them the same name. So I'm gonna close all this and we're gonna go back to the UI. And again, I need to bring this in, and that's what I just did here so that I can use it in the UI. So I'm gonna copy this, go back here, oops, and paste it in, and we're gonna check for server up. So I'm gonna do that. Server, it's auto completing for me because I'm using a type. So I'm checking to see if it's server up. So I'm gonna put a question mark, and I'm gonna scroll this over a little bit so you can see. So I'm gonna say if the server is up, then add this class, and I'm gonna put a space because I don't want this to be the same, because if you don't put the space, then this badge is gonna be one string. So make sure you put a space, and then we want badge success. So we're gonna say badge dash success, and those are our Bootstrap classes, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with those. And then I'm gonna put a colon and then do badge danger so that it can be red. Then I'm gonna copy this, paste it here, and change this to danger. And then again, for the status, we can do something similar because I don't want to show this server underscore up. I want to show server up without the underscore. So let's do something similar. We're gonna check to see if the status is up. So I'm just gonna copy all of this and then paste it in here. You can do the same in here as well. So we're checking to see if the status is up. Then we're gonna say server up. So let's just copy this, and here we don't need the space, and we're just gonna remove the underscore just like that. And if this is not the case, then we're gonna say server down. So we're gonna do server down. So instead of showing the actual status, which is gonna be server underscore up or server underscore down, we're checking to see if it's server up, then we're gonna show this string instead. Otherwise, we're gonna show this string. And of course, we're doing the same by adding a class dynamically, which is gonna be the badge success if the server is up, which is gonna be green, or badge danger if the server is down. So now if we go back, everything should work. And you can see we have server up without the underscore, and then it's green, server down without the underscore, and then it's red. So our UI is coming together nicely. And the next thing I want to work on is this ping right here, because we don't want to show the loading and the little ping icon or the little router icon at the same time. We only want to show one, and then whenever they ping one server, we're going to show the loading only for this specific server. So let's go ahead and work on that. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code, and I want to go to the component. So let's go inside of the component, and I want to create a filter subject. So I'm going to go down and then create a private field, and I'm going to call it filter subject, and it's going to be a subject. So we're going to say filter subject, set it equal to a new behavior subject. So I'm going to do new behavior subject, and we have to give it a type, and that's going to be a string. And we also have to initialize it with an initial value because it's a behavior subject. So here I'm going to give it an empty string. So this is going to be the filter subject. And then I want to create another observable of that filter subject. So I'm going to say filter, let's just copy this name. And I'm just going to put filter and call it status, for example, filter status, and put a $sign because it's going to be an observable. And then I'm going to set this to this, that filtered, that as observable. Oh, not the filter status. This is supposed to be the filter subject, and we want it as an observable. So this is our behavior subject, the filter subject, and the filter status, which is what we're going to be using in the UI, is an observable of that filter subject. And if you guys are not familiar with RxJS and the behavior subject and subject, you can go ahead and Google it. I don't want to go into the explanation right now because it can be a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to show you how I'm going to use this. If you guys want me to make a tutorial about behavior subject and RxJS in general, then I can do that. I have a lot of courses pile up and a lot of tutorials pile up, and I have to finish those first, and I don't have anything in the near future on my list to do with RxJS. But if you guys really want it, just let me know. I can actually do it. But we're going to be using this subject in the UI, and then we're going to react to it accordingly so that we can show the loading spinner or the little icon to ping the server. So now we can go back in the UI and use this observable so that we can determine when we want to show the little spinning icon or the router icon. So let's go back to the UI, and we want to go into this guy right there. So And here, what we want to do is to either show this ping server with this material icon, or we're gonna show the spinner with the font awesome spinner. So up here, I'm gonna do ngIf. So I'm gonna do ngIf and set it equal to, and then I'm gonna put parentheses, and then I'm gonna pass in the observable. Remember, this is an observable, so we have to subscribe to it, and we can do that by using the async pipe. So I'm gonna do async, and then we need to check to see if it's empty. So we're gonna put empty string, or we want to make sure that this subject doesn't equal the current IP address of the current server and the iteration. So I'm going to copy this again one more time and then go over here and then paste it. And this time I'm going to use the not operator. So I'm going to put a question mark here. And then I want to make sure this doesn't equal the current server and the iteration for that IP address. So here I'm going to pass in the server IP address. So that's the first condition that we need. For the second condition, so for us to show the little spinner, we just have to check to make sure that the current filter status, which is pretty much going to be the IP address, actually equals the IP address in the current iteration. So we can just copy all this and then go down and paste it here. And I'm just gonna remove all of this and then just check to see if it equals the current IP address in the current iteration for that server. So if this filter status equal the IP address, then we're gonna show this. If it equals empty or it doesn't equal the current IP address in the iteration, then we're gonna show ping server. And that's gonna do the trick for us. And remember, we initialize this with an empty string. So currently this condition should be true and we should show ping server. So let's go back to the UI and you can see we have this little icon here that says ping server. And if we go back to VS Code real quick, the way that we're gonna control this filtered status, so this observable that we define here, is whenever we're gonna ping the server. So whenever we ping a server, we're gonna call this subject and then we give it the current IP address. So whoever is subscribed to this, they're gonna react to it in the UI and they're gonna be like, okay, this equal the current IP address of the server and the current iteration. Then it's gonna show the spinner and this is gonna be no longer true. So it's no longer gonna show the little icon to ping the server. And another thing I wanna point out is me using an observable. As you can see here, I'm using a subject and then I'm using an observable. So why would I do that when I could just use a simple variable? Like I can just define a variable that's not an observable. And that's what I'm gonna tell you at the end of the course. I'm gonna tell you why we take this approach and some of the benefits that you can get from using this approach. One last thing I want to do in the UI before we actually continue adding the other functions that we need. So the functions to add a new server, filter the servers and delete a server. I want to add the error in the UI as well. So remember, if we go back inside of the application state, we know there's a scenario where we can get an error. So which is going to be a string. So back here, when we subscribe to this observable, we know that whenever we get an error, which is going to go inside of this block, then the error message is going to be in here, which is going to be a string. So off of the application state, we'll have an error property, as you can see here. So this is the interface that we're using. So application state, it will have an error property, which is going to be a string. So we can capture this as well. And whenever there's an error, we can show this string to the user, which is being captured as well in our service. So if I go inside of the service, we're catching it right down there. And we're just showing this generic message for whatever error that occurs with the status. So I'm going to go back inside of the UI and scroll down. So here we're showing this error, which is just hard coded. So we can turn this into the actual error that we're getting from the backend or we're just getting in general. So I'm going to put double curly braces, access the application state. So I'm going to do app state dot error because we know that property is going to exist. So if there's an error, then this UI or this container is going to show and it's going to have this little message in there, as you can see here. So that's going to be our string error. So if we go back to the UI, we shouldn't see any changes because there's no error, but I can simulate an error and then I can show you what that looks like. So let's go back to the backend and I'm going to minimize this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is to just make this throw an exception after 3 seconds. So I'm going to go down here, go down, and then I'm gonna say throw, and let's make this throw a runtime exception. So I'm gonna say runtime exception and then pass in a message here. I'm gonna say something went wrong and put a semicolon here, and we need to just comment out all this code. This is supposed to be new. So we're gonna throw a new runtime exception, or we can even throw this exception since we already have it here. And I don't know if this exception takes a message in the constructor, but we'll see. All right, so we get no errors. So this constructor, it actually takes a message, so we get no errors. So we can run the application, and then after 3 seconds, it's gonna give us an error, which is gonna be the string. We're not really capturing this in anything, and I can show you how we can capture this. So let's go ahead and rerun this, and we're gonna test this out. All right, so the application is running, as you can see here. So let's go back to the UI and refresh. and wait, you're gonna see an error occur, and then we get 500. So we get the UI piece where there is an error. So if you want to capture the error message, so let's see if we can inspect this a little bit. So if I go in here, right, and I go into the console, and I have this HTTP error response. So that's from Angular. This is the object that they use to capture HTTP error response, and you can extend this. And if I go inside of this, so if I extend this a little bit, you can see that we have this error here, and we can capture this information as well. We can look at the message. If I extend this a little bit more, and then we get a 500. Okay, so that's bad because 500 is an error. So you can grab whatever you want from this error message. But if you want to capture the error that we set up in the backend, like this, something went wrong. So let's go back to the backend. So if you actually want to capture this, then you need to do exception handling. And this is something that I'm not covering in this course, but this is extremely important when you're building an API, because you want to be able to capture all of your exception and then return something to the user, like something that the user can understand. They can see, okay, this is the error that occurs. Let me see how I can fix it. And this is something that we can do as well. And you should do it whenever you're building your API. But in this particular case, I'm just not doing the exception handling, but it's super, super important. You can see that we have the exception that happens here. So interrupted exception, and here's the message, something went wrong. But I just wanted to show you that if we have an error, then the error is going to come up here, and you will see that we have the UI piece that represents the error. So let's go back to the backend, and I'm going to just undo all of this because we don't need to send this error, and I'm going to remove this line as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and run the application. So run, stop and rerun. All right, so everything looks good. If we go back again and refresh, we're in loading state, and we get our data. All right, so everything looks good. So in the next videos, we're gonna be working on the other functions that we need to, filter everything, add a new server, and then print the report, and also to be able to ping a server. Let's go ahead and work on the ping at this point. So let's go back to the application, and I'm gonna scroll down and copy this function, and I'm gonna paste it down here, and I'm gonna change the name to ping server. So we're gonna say ping server, so ping server, and this is gonna take the IP address because we need to know which IP address we're gonna be pinging, and we're gonna pass this in as a string, and this function is gonna return void, so the return type is fine here, and we're gonna keep all this code the same. And the first thing I want to do, if you guys remember, we define this filter subject so that we can show the little spinner whenever we're pinging a server. So the first thing I want to do is to omit something on this subject so that the server's IP address can have the little spinner instead of the router. So the first thing we do whenever we call this function to ping a server is to pass the IP address to the filter subject. So I'm gonna call next on this, and then I'm gonna pass in the IP address. So that way the server with that IP address will have the little spinner instead of the little router. So we're gonna show the spinner so that way the user knows that we're pinging the server for that specific IP address. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we have to call the ping. So I'm gonna remove the server and then call the ping, and then pass in the IP address again. So I'm going to say, here's the IP address, make the call to the backend, ping the server. Now remember, when we ping a server in the backend, it returns the server that is pinged. So if the status was changed, then we're going to have the server and the response. So what we need to do is we need to wait for the response. So we're going to do exactly what we're doing here. And then once we get the response, we're going to set the server that we got from the backend to replace the server that we have in the front end for that specific server that they just pinged. And as you can see at this point, I'm not retaining this data that I get. So whenever I get this data, I just pass it to this observable. So I don't have any way to access it in this specific component. So what I want to do is to define a variable, and then I'm going to store this response inside of it so that whenever I get this response, I can look for that specific server and then replace it and then pass the response again to this observable. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll up, and I need another behavior subject. So I'm going to put my mouse on this line. I'm going to press Shift Alt with the down arrow key so that I can make a copy of this line, and I'm gonna rename this. I'm gonna call it data subject, and this is gonna be of type custom HTTP response because this is the response that we're receiving from the backend. Oops. So I'm gonna copy this and then paste it here instead of string, and we're gonna initialize it with null. We can put null or undefined, either one. So we're gonna start with null. So I'm gonna copy this data subject, and in the ng on init, whenever we get the data, so on this line right here, we're gonna say this data subject dot next, and then we're gonna pass in the response because that's what it's expecting. So all we're doing here is after we make the first call to the backend, so this ng on init is gonna be call, And once we get a response, the first thing we're going to do is to save the response inside of this data subject so that we can have a copy of this data in the component, because we're going to need it later down here. So that's all we're doing. So I'm defining this data subject, which is a behavior subject of the response, so the custom response, which is what this is. Like if I hover over this, you can see that it's the custom response, which is the response that we get from the backend with all the servers, the status code, the message, everything. So we're saving this data inside of this data subject. Now I'm going to scroll down. So here then, whenever I make the call to the backend, I'm going to show the spinner for that specific IP address, because this is what this line is doing, line 41. And then I'm going to call ping on the service, give it the IP address so that you can make the call to the backend and then try to ping the server. And all of this is being done in the backend. So we're doing the same thing again, and we're going to come back to this in a second. But now we're not going to start with the loading state because the data is already loaded. So whenever we initialize this ng on init, we got some data at some point, right? So when we call this ping server, we're not going to say the data is loading because the data is already there. We already received the data. So we have to change the state, and then we're going to say loaded state because the data is loaded. And then for the data, so I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. So for the data, we don't have this response, right? Because at this point, we're giving the observable something to begin with. So that's with the start with. So we don't have access to this response, which is only going to happen whenever this is resolved. This observable that's going to make the call to the backend whenever it's resolved. So we don't have access to this response in here. So we have to give this the existing data. So the existing data, which is right here. So we can call this. So here I'm going to say this, that, data subject. To get whatever you save in this data subject, you call the value. So this is going to give us all the value, or whatever we saved earlier. You can see that is of type custom issue response. So we're going to give this to the UI to begin with. So when this function is called, it's going to say, all right, I need to make a call to the backend, but I'm going to start with this data, which is state loaded, because we're not fetching the data for the first time. We're in loaded state, and the data is whatever we saved initially after we call ng on init. So when we call ng on init, we save the response in this data subject. And then here we're just accessing this response, which is going to be pretty much the same response. So we're passing it here to start with while this HTTP call is being made. So now all we have to do with this response whenever we get it is to loop through all of the servers that we have saved in this data subject and then replace the server that we get back from the backend inside of this array so that we can update any updated information that we might have gotten from the backend, which in this case is going to be the status. So if the status of that particular server that we're trying to ping, if this status was updated, then we will have the updated status and then we can show it to the UI. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to say this, that data subject, and then I'm going to access the value again. And on that value, you can see that we have all the properties that we're supposed to have because we typed this correctly. So what I want to do is to access the data. So I'm going to access the data, and I know the data is an object and I need to access the servers. So I'm going to access all the servers. So the servers, it's an array if you guys remember, and I need to find the index. So I'm going to put opening and closing bracket. So I need to find the index of the server that the user pinged and then replace it with the server that we get in this response so that we can get any updated information. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the find index that you can call on arrays and then give it a condition. I'm going to go ahead and put this on the new line, and all I want to do is I want to access all the servers again. So I'm going to copy all this because this is the only data that I can work with. That's the data that I have saved. And then I'm going to say find index because we need to find the index of some server in this list, which is the server that the user pinged. And then I'm going to say for every server in that list, we want to execute some piece of code with the callback function. And again, I'm going to put this on a new line. And I'm going to say if the server that ID equal the response that data that server, because remember when we ping a server in the backend, in this case, what we get in the data is just one server, not the list of all the servers, but we get a server. And if we go back real quick, just to make sure you guys can connect all these dots, if we go back in the custom HTTP response, you can see that the data can be sometimes a list of server, which is the case when we call this servers, we get a list of servers, or it can also be just one server. And that is the case when we ping a server. So whenever we ping a server, this response data will contain a server. It's not going to contain servers, but just one server. And what we want to do is to access the ID on that server. So whatever we get from the backend, whatever server we get from the backend, we're gonna check to see where these IDs are the same. So we're gonna loop through all the servers that we currently have in the front end, and we're gonna say we need to find the index. So this is going to give us the index in this list right here. So the position of that server that we're looking for. And the condition we're giving the find index is wherever the server ID equals the server ID. We could also do this for the IP address, because we know that the IP address is always going to be unique for every single server. But ID is a little bit more secure here, because we know the backend ID and the frontend ID, they're definitely going to be the same. So remember, we put the bracket here, and then we put this code inside of it. So all of these two lines, so line 46 and 47, is going to return just an index. And you can see that we have the opening and closing bracket. So we're inside of the servers, we're going to have this index for that particular server that the user just pinged. So in that case, then we can say set this server. So for whatever index you find for that server, set it equal to the response that server. And that's how we're going to update our data subject, because the only thing we have to do is to just replace this server that the user ping with the server that we get in the response, just to get any updated information. And then at this point, then for the data, we can also pass the same value, because we just updated it. And then we're just going to paste this here. And then we have some cleanup to do. So I'm going to copy this line and then paste it down here and set this to an empty string, because remember, after we process everything, we have to set this to an empty string so that we'll stop showing the loading spinner and then show the loader router, so that the user can ping the server again if they want to. And we're going to do this even when we get a failure. So I'm going to go down here and paste this subject next, and then pass an empty string so that we can stop showing the spinner even when we have an error, because we don't want to, show an error, say, hey, something happened, we couldn't ping the server, and then the spinner is still spinning. We have to stop the spinner. And that's pretty much everything you have to do for this. And another way we can do this, just to make sure you guys can see this clearly. So I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to define another variable up here. I'm going to say constant index, and then set it equal to this, just like that. All right. So maybe this can make more sense in case you didn't understand clearly. So I'm going to see if I can put this on a new line. So you see that I'm defining this index here, and we're going to access all the servers and then find the index where the server's IDs are the same. And you can see that's what I'm doing here. And we need to close this. All right. So we're going to find the index by say for all the servers, loop through them, wherever the IDs are the same, then that's the index that you're going to give us for that specific server in the array. And then with that index, so if I make this a little bit smaller, if I put this all on one line, we're going to say index. All right. So remember, this is all of our data. So this is all the list of the servers. So for this particular server at that particular index, replace it with this server that we just got from the backend. So maybe when I put this on two lines, it can be a little bit clearer for you guys. But with defining this index that we're trying to find and the existing data that we already have in the front end, we're just looping through them. And then we call define index, which is going to give us the index. And then we set the condition. We say wherever these two IDs are the same. So the ID of the server that we're looping through that we already have in the front end, whenever these two IDs are the same. So the ID of the server that we got from the backend, you can see we're accessing it from the response. Whenever this condition is met, then that's the index we need to find. So this is going to give us the index of this particular server in the array. And then once we have this particular index, we're going to say, all right, so now that we know the position of this server in the list, then in that same list at this particular position, replace that server with the server that we got from the backend, so that we can get any updated information. And that's only going to be the server status, because that's the only thing that can change whenever we ping the server. We're not going to change anything else. And then after that, then this data subject, you can see it right here, is updated, and we just return it as the data for the front end. And then after we do that, we stop the spinner. So we pass in an empty string to the filter subject, and then we do the same if we get an error. And that's all we have to do for the ping server. So now what we need to do is to hook this up in the UI and just see it in action. So I'm gonna scroll over a little bit and just copy this ping server function name and go back to the UI. And we need to go right here. So wherever we have this anchor tag, I'm gonna put a click event here. So I'm gonna say open and close parentheses and then click. So we're registering a click event, and whenever this occurs, we want to call our function. Remember, we're still in the loop in the table. So let me scroll to the right a little. Remember, we're still inside of this table. So we're looping through all of the servers you can see here. So we have access to each server in their IP address. So here we can say server.ip address. So we pass in the IP address to ping server, which is what it's expecting. And that's pretty much everything we have to do in terms of the UI. So whenever the user clicks on this button, we're gonna call ping server, pass in the IP address, and then we're gonna do all of this processing. So let's see if it works. Let's go back to the UI. All right, everything looks good. So I don't have any issues. So now let's go ahead and try to ping, let's say the first server. And ping. Okay, so it looks like it was successful. Let's open the developer tool just so we can take a look. So if I clear this and refresh, so that we can get a new set of response. So here's the response, and you can see inside of the data, I have 4 servers. All right, so the first one is 160, as you can see here. So let's see if we can ping it. So ping. All right, so let's go back. You can see that the call was successful, so we get the 200 from the backend, and the message was ping success. Inside of the data, we have the server, which is the same server with ID 1. So everything seems to be working. So let's do another one. Gonna collapse some of these. So let's do this one. Let's do the 58 because I don't think I have this 58 connected. So it should take some time. We should see the loading spinner, and then it should give us, server ping fail. So let's do this. You can see it's spinning now for only the server, and then you can see ping fail. And inside, we're going to have that particular server with any updated information. In that case, this was already down, so the server down is still the same. So the ping seems to be working, and you can try it for all of them. It should work just fine. Okay, so that didn't work. So I don't think I have this 21 either in my network. So if we ping that one, it should take some time, and then the server up should turn to server down. So let's try that one. Okay, let's let it go. You can see server down because we updated the server in the list. So everything is working as expected. Now let's go ahead and work on the filter. So whenever we select one of these filters, we want to see the list filtered. Let's go back to the code again, and I'm gonna copy this function again. So copy all this, scroll down and paste it down. And this is going to be the filter server. So I'm gonna rename this to filter servers. All right. So whenever we're filtering a server, the only thing we need is the status. So I'm going to change this to the status, and this is going to be of type status. And this is supposed to come from our enum. I don't need to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this line, remove it down there as well, so that I don't forget. And I'm going to remove everything inside here because I'm not going to be doing this processing. And this time we're not going to call the ping. We're going to go ahead and call the filter. So filter, and we need to pass in the status that we got from the function up here. So this status, and then we need to give it the data. So the current data, you already guessed it, it's inside of this guy right here. So you can see how important it was for us to keep a copy of this data because we're gonna need to pass it around. So oops, I'm gonna pass it here. So we're passing in the data, so the current HTTP response that we have, and we give it the status. And again, the data is loaded, so we're still in loaded state, and we're keeping the current UI the way it is. So we're not changing this data at all. So we're giving it the same data. So this is gonna stay. The error, of course, this is gonna be the same. And we can put a semicolon here just to end this line. This is not required, but I'm a Java developer, so I like my semicolons. And what we're going to do is wait for this response. So we're gonna do exactly the same thing. So everything is the same, but this time we need to use this response. So we're not gonna use this data. We're gonna pass the response. So remember, this is our data, because we're not making another call to the backend when we call this filter. We're not getting any new data. We're not calling the list. So we have to preserve this data whenever the user filter back to all. So if the user filter to server up, then we're going to have all the server up in here. So that's the response we're giving back to this observable. In this component, we still keep a copy of the original data inside of this data subject. So you have to be very careful. We don't want to return this data subject. We want to return whatever filtered response that we get from calling the filter observable, and then we pass it here so that this data will be intact. So if the user filter back to all again, we say, okay, we get the status, this function is called, we give him all the data. So all the data with all the server that we got whenever we initialize here, and then we got all this data from the back. So you have to be careful with that, because data integrity in this case is very important. We don't want to override this data and then we'll be stuck in the UI, because we'll get rid of the existing data that we get. So you don't want this user experience. And just to recap one more time, when we call this function in the UI, the only thing we're going to need from the user is the status. So we're going to say, okay, what status do you want, which they're going to pick by just selecting one of them in the drop down. And then we're going to give this filter all the data that we already have in this component. So all the data that we got from whenever this component was loaded, or whenever, like if the user pinged the server, like the latest data that we got, it's going to be inside of this data subject. So all the data, all of it. And then when we call the filter, we give it this fresh data, and then it's going to give us a response. And then that's the response we're going to give to the front end, or we're going to give to this observable. Because if this is filtered server, then we don't want to filter this data subject, because then we will lose all the data that we had. And then if the user select all, then we have to give the user all the data or all the servers, then we won't have them because we filtered that list. So we want to make sure that we keep this intact, like we don't touch this, and we return this response that we got from calling the filter on the service. And everything else is the same. We're going to start with the loaded state, because the data is loaded, and then give the existing data to the UI. And now we just have to hook up this function in the UI. So I'm going to copy it again and then go back to the UI, and let's make our way to this drop down list. It's right here. So this is the drop down list. You can see the select. So that's our drop down list, and you can see everything is already set because I already did this for us. So server down, server up, and then all, and these are the texts that we're showing to the UI. So now we just have to hook this up in the select. So here we're going to use the ng model change, because we need to watch for a change in the select. So we're going to say ng model and then change, and then set this equal to our function. So equal quotations and then pass the function. And here we're just gonna pass in the event. So whatever the event is, it's gonna be whatever the value is inside of the option. So whenever this ng model change occurs, which means whenever this select one of these options is changed, then the event is actually gonna be this value right here. So we're passing this event, which is pretty much this value that we're passing into this filter server. And then by default, we need to give it a value. So we're gonna say ng model. Let's set this equal to all. So we're gonna say all. So because we add this on this select, then it's not gonna know what the default is. So the default is gonna be with this ng model, and we're gonna set it to all. And this is really not gonna take effect. Like this is not gonna be called, because when we get the data, it's this ng on init that's gonna set the data for us. So it's gonna be the default, but it's not gonna be called on initialization. It's just gonna be here to show the user at this current moment, you're looking at all the servers, nothing has been filtered. So now let's go back to the UI. And gonna open the developer tool again. I think we're logging some of this stuff, and let's see if we can filter. So server up, you can see that it's filtered, and we get our log. And I can do server down, you can see that the list filtered. And now if I go back to all servers, then we get all the servers. So this functionality is working as expected, and you can go ahead and play more with it. I already know that it's working, but go ahead and play around with it. It should be working as expected, as you can see here. So now let's go ahead and work on the serve server. So we're gonna make sure we can capture a new server when the user fills out this form, and then whenever they click save, we're gonna send that to the backend, and we're gonna show that new server in this list right here. So let's go ahead and work on that. So I'm gonna go back to the code, and I'm just gonna copy this ping, and I'm gonna scroll down and then paste it. And I'm gonna call it save server. So we're gonna say save server. And this is gonna take the ng form. So let's call this server form, and it's gonna be of type ng form. So this is ng form coming from Angular. As you can see, it's coming from Angular forms, and that's what we're gonna take in here. We don't need to do anything with this filter. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this line, and we're gonna call the service. This time, we're not gonna call the ping, we're gonna call the save. So we call the save. And then we're gonna give it the form value. So the form value, it's gonna represent a JSON object of the data that we pass into the form. So we're gonna say server form that value, and that's what we're gonna pass here. If I hover over this, you're gonna see that it's gonna give me the type any, but that's not a problem because it's gonna be converted into an object with the keys and values that we need for the backend, so the backend will be able to interpret it. But if you want, you can cast this here. For example, you can put the diamond again, and then you can say this is gonna be a server. You can do it that way, so that should work as well. Or another thing you can do, you can pass it in as a server. So you can put it like this, and then you say as server. So either way it will work. It's not gonna be a problem. And we're getting this error because it looks like it's importing server from the wrong place. So let's look at our import. This is not where we want to import that. I'm gonna delete it and see if I can re-import it. Quick fix, and it's supposed to come from our interface just like that. So you can do it that way, or you can do it in front with the diamond, but it doesn't really matter because this is not going to cause a problem even if we didn't cast it. I just wanted to show you that you can actually cast it if you want to. So when we call the save, what the save is going to return us from the back end, it's going to return us the object or the server that we just saved, right? So we're going to do the same thing again, meaning when we start, we're going to start with data loaded, and then we're going to keep the existing data on the UI so that we don't have any glitch in the UI. Like you're going to see the UI disappear and it reappears again when the call comes back, or if the call takes a long time, then it's just going to disappear and then come back. We don't want that to happen. So we always want to have our data to be shown to the user because the data already loaded initially when we call engine in it, like I already explained. Now the next thing we want to do is we're not gonna do all this, so I'm gonna just delete some of this stuff. What we want to do when we get the data, so let's just delete all these lines just so you guys can see this clearly. So when we get the data back, right, we're gonna still return this data, but we're gonna modify it. And what we're going to do is the new server that we're gonna get back, we're gonna add it to the list of servers inside of this object, which is containing all of our information or all of our data. And we can do this pretty simply. So we can go down here and we can call this data, and I call the data subject. So this is all the data that we have in the application. And what I want to do is to just push on a new object on it, or I'm just going to change the information inside of this data object. And then what I'm going to do is to just pass in everything that I already have. So let's go on a new line, and I'm going to pass an object, and I'm going to copy everything that I have in the response. So I'm going to do the spread operator again, copy the response. And the only thing that I want to change is the data. And remember, the data is an object, so open and close curly braces. You can see that the error is gone because we can actually pass in an empty object. And what we need to do here is to just put the new server on top of the list or on top of the array, and then add the existing ones after the first one. So we can do that pretty easily. We can just say we're going to override the servers. Remember, this object has a property called servers. So we're going to say for the servers, which is an array, we're going to define the bracket so that we can see this is going to be an array. What we're going to do is to pass in the server that we got back. So the server that just got saved in the backend, which gets returned to us from the API. We're going to put that server at the beginning of our array. So we're going to say response.data, and we need to access the server. So that's going to override the data, particularly the server's property inside of that object, and then replace it. And then we need to pass in the existing servers. So for that, we know where to go get it. So we're going to say this, that data subject, that data, that's, oops, we have to do that data. We have to access the value first, and then data, and then we need the servers. So we're going to say servers. And of course, we're spreading this, so we need to pass in the spread operator here as well. And we don't need to do this response. Again, just to reiterate, we're going to change this data. We're going to push next onto it. So we're going to push a new object onto it. And the object we're going to push is everything that we got from the response so that we can capture all the metadata in the response. And the only thing we're overriding is this data. So what we're overriding is the servers because that's what we're displaying on the UI. We're going to say for the servers, take the first server that we got back from the response, put it at index 0 in the array, and then give us all the other ones that we already have in the existing data. So from the data subject, and then we're going to put them after the first one or after the one that just got saved so that it can be on top of the list. And after we do this, there's some cleanup things we have to do. So now we have our data, it's updated, and that's the data that we're passing it here. So we don't have to make any changes in the return, but we do have to close the modal, and we're just going to do that the typical JavaScript way. So I'm going to say document.get element by ID, and then pass in the button ID. So here, I think I named it close modal. So that's the ID of the button. And once we get that button, we can just call the click function on it because we know it's going to exist because we're accessing a button. So this is going to close the modal, and then the data is going to be updated after we return this, and the user will see the new server that they just added. It's going to be on top of the list. And then after we do all this, another thing we have to do is to reset the form. So I'm going to call the server form, and let's call it reset form. And then here, what I want to do is to pass a new object because I want to reset the form, but I want to set the status to be a default, and that's going to be the server down. I don't think I need to put space here. but I'll put space here. So I'm going to update the status. So you can see it's coming up here. For the status, I'm gonna say this is gonna be this that status, so the status that we have in this class, and then call server down. So we're gonna put a default in the form, which is gonna be server down, and that's the only field that we're updating in the form. All the other fields are gonna be empty because we're not setting anything for them. But for the status, we're gonna say, okay, the status by default, whenever you open the form again after we reset the form, we're only gonna set the status to server down. And you can change this if you want. You can put anything you want, or you can just reset the form, or just call the reset. It's gonna empty everything. Another feature I need to handle is the loading. So you remember in the demo, when we click the save, you can see that the text on the button is changed. We give the user an indication that something is happening in the backend. So we show them the loading in the button itself. We show the little spinner going on. So we need to have a way, or we need to have a variable defined in here so that we can manage this little spinner that we show in the button. And this really improves the user experience. So for this, we're gonna define another observable. So I'm just gonna copy these two lines, or I'm just gonna highlight them, and then I think I have to press a Shift Alt and then a down arrow key, and I'm gonna rename this to is loading. So we're gonna say is loading. So that's gonna be the name that I'm gonna give this, and this is gonna be of type Boolean. So I'm gonna remove this custom response and then pass in Boolean. So by default, we're gonna start with false, of course, because we don't want it to be spinning. So this is the subject, and then we're gonna create an observable out of the subject. So I'm gonna give it the same name, just call it is loading, and then point it to this is loading right there. Change this to is loading, and then we're looking at it as an observable. So now we have this variable that we can use in the UI. So the one with the $, we can use it in the UI, and then the one which is the subject, we can use it to set the value on this is loading observable. So now let's go back. I'm gonna scroll down, and when we save the server, or when we call this function in the UI, right? Well, first thing we're gonna do is to just set this loading to true. So I'm gonna say this loading dot next, and then post true on it because it's accepting a Boolean value, as you can see here. So I'm gonna say it's true now. So whoever in the UI is subscribed to this observable, then they're gonna get this true value. And then because we're gonna have like an if condition in front of it, then it's gonna show the little spinner. You already see how this is gonna go. So I'm gonna copy this again, and I'm gonna paste it down here. So before we reset the form, and then I'm gonna change this to false because we want to stop the spinner. And then I'm gonna do the same thing again, and I'm gonna duplicate this and see if I can bring this down. Yay. And I'm also gonna delete this line. All right, so we're gonna set it to false even when we get an error, because we don't want it to keep spinning. We want to stop all spinning, indicating to the user that all processes in the backend have ended. So we're gonna be using this is loading observable. So the is loading with the $, so that one, we're gonna use it in the UI. And you're gonna see again why I'm doing it that way. You're gonna see that in the end why I'm using observable instead of using just regular variable name here. Now remember, we're using ng form, so you can see that we're using it here, and we're also gonna be using it in the template. So we have to add this in our module. So let's go back to the main module, so the app module, and then we're just gonna I think it's already here. So the forms module, you have to make sure that this is imported. So maybe I put it in, I didn't realize, but you have to make sure that you have the forms module, and it's supposed to come from Angular forms. So I'm gonna close out of this and collapse this. Now let's go to the UI, and then we're gonna hook up our form, and then hook the form to this function so that we can call this function and pass the form to this function, and then execute this logic so that we can see what happens in the UI. So let's go back to the UI. And we need to scroll down to the modal, because that's where the form is. So I'm gonna scroll to the right so you can see add server modal, which is just a typical Bootstrap modal. And the first thing we want to do is to go into this form tag. So here we have to call our function. So first we need to give Angular access to this form in an Angular way, if that makes sense. And to do this, we're gonna set a variable for this form. So I'm gonna say server form, and then set it equal to ng form. So this is how you make a form, an Angular form. So ng form, and then we're gonna say ng submit. So we're gonna listen to the unsubmit. So ng submit, and then we're gonna set this equal to our function. So we're gonna say save server, and then we're gonna pass it the form. Remember, it's expecting the form, and the form is server form. So whenever there is a submit event that occurs on this form, then it's gonna pass this ng form that we're calling server form, pass it to the save server function, and this function is gonna execute all this logic. So now what we have to do is to get this information, so the information from the input. And to do this, we just need to add ng model on these inputs. So I'm gonna say ng model and then copy this and then do it down there for the name. And I'm gonna do it again for the memory and do it for the type. And then we're gonna do it again for the status. So I'm gonna say ng model, and we can set the default here as well for the UI. So we're gonna say, let's say server down. Okay, so that's what we're going with. And then we already have all of our button here. So I have this button and I have the icon as well. So we only have to show this whenever the is loading is true. And also just while I'm here, this is the ID of the button that we're gonna click. So that's the cancel button. So it's just the typical cancel button on the Bootstrap modal. So we're just gonna click this button and it's gonna make the modal go away. So on the submit button, so this button, by the way, you really have to have the type submit here. That's how it's gonna fire this on submit, because it's listening to this submit type down there. So make sure your submit button, it has the type of submit. So now the first thing I want to do is to disable this button unless the form is valid. And for the form to be valid, you need to have the required annotation. So you can see that I have the required on all of the input here. So make sure you have that. And here I'm going to access the disable. So I'm going to say disabled and then set it equal to if the server form is invalid. So I'm going to say server form invalid. Or if it's loading. So if we have something loading, we also want this to be disabled. So what I'm gonna do is to subscribe to that observable. So I'm gonna say is loading with the $. Remember, we have to access the observable. And then the way we're gonna subscribe to it is by using the async pipe. So here we're gonna say async. Okay, so remember to do that. And that's why I put the parentheses, because this is now some kind of a statement. So I want to separate this into one statement. And then for the saving, so again, we're only gonna show this on a specific condition, which is this condition, whenever this is true. So we can just come in here and we're gonna just put an ng if. So I'm gonna put star and then ng if, and then set it equal to the condition, which is loading with the $. Well, actually I can just copy it from here and then paste it here. So if it's loading is true and we're subscribing to this observable, then it's gonna show this spinner. And we have to do the same for the saving. So I'm gonna copy the same statement, go into the saving and then paste it. So if this is true, it's gonna show the saving, and it's also gonna show the little spinner next to the button text. And then we just have to do the opposite and the add, because we want to show it when this is not true. So we're gonna go here and I'm gonna enclose this in parentheses and then just put the not operator. And that's all we have to do here to manage what we're showing to the UI. So we're gonna show the saving text on the button and the little spinner when is loading is true. And when this is true as well, we're gonna disable the button, because we don't want them to click the button when something is happening in the backend. We don't want them to send multiple different requests for the same information. And when the opposite is true, so we negate this statement, we're just gonna show the add. And remember, by default, we set this to be false. So if we go back here, you can see that when we create the behavior subject, we set this to be false by default. So when the UI loads, it's gonna read this observable, subscribe to it, and it's gonna say, oh, this is false. And this is gonna turn it to true. So this is gonna show. And when the opposite happens, then these two are gonna be true, and then the last one is gonna be false. And that's pretty much everything we have to do for this form. And now we can go ahead and test it out. So what I'm gonna do first is to check to see if I didn't get any errors in the console. So I'm gonna open my terminal. Okay, so everything is working fine. So you see that everything rebuilt and we didn't get any error. So that looks good. So now let's go back to the UI. UI looks good as well. So we only have to go ahead and test this out. So let's put some random number here. So I'm gonna do new PC 16 gig, and let's say this is mail server or something. And you can already see that we don't see the little spinner. Now we see the add text on the button. So I can click on add, and you can see now we have the saving and it's spinning. So you can see that the new one is added right here, and we get our response. So you can see the created, status code to 1, and the timestamp and everything. And now if we want, we can try to ping the server. And of course, this is probably gonna give us an error. And you can see that we got the error on error occurred, and then we got 500, and you can see the error as well in the console. So we're able to save a new server, and I refresh the page and you see that the server is not at the bottom, and we really don't want that. The last one to be added, we want it to be on top. And we can fix this real quick. We can either fix it in the back end, we can either write a query in JPA in the back end to do that. We can use Java to do that in the back, or we can just do it in the front end. And I'm going to show you how we can do it in the front end really easily. So let's go back to the code, and let's go back here. And what I want to do is to scroll down. So when we get this information, right? So when we have ng on init and we're passing in this app data here, so we can just access all of the servers and then reverse the list of all the servers. So for the app data, right, which is an object, so of custom HTTP response, we can just do the same thing again. So I'm going to put open and close curly braces, and I'm going to say, give me everything from the response. So ... So I can spread everything from the response, and then I can just override the data. So here I'm going to say for the data property, so I'm going to say data, and remember the data is an object, so open and close curly braces again. And then here I'm going to say for the servers property, so servers, and I'm going to scroll to the right so you guys can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to say get the response, get the data, access the servers, and then just call the reverse. So I can call the reverse, and it's a function, so open and close parentheses. So I want to keep this on one line, so I want to make sure you guys can see that. So all I'm doing here is just return the state of loaded, and then for the app data, earlier we were passing in just a response. So I'm gonna say, okay, so now pass me this object, which is also gonna be of type custom HTTP response because it has the same property. We're gonna say give me everything in the response, so everything that we're not overriding, we're gonna keep it. So that's what this is doing. And then we say we're going to override the data, and specifically the servers property on the data. And then this is going to be all the servers, just reverse them. So now if we go back, you can see that the last one is on top. So that was pretty cool. I just wanted to show you that you can actually fix that because you don't want the newest one to be at the bottom. And again, you can keep testing this. Like if I put some dummy data in there, blah, 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 and then hit save and wait for a few seconds. And you can see that it's edited at the top. And if I refresh it again and let it come back, you can see that it's still at the top. The reason this is taking a little time, even though it's on my local, it's because we have this delay in the back end. So it's not really supposed to be that slow, but just so you guys can see the different states of the application. So feel free to remove this delay if you don't like it, but I just wanted to point that out. So the add is working. Now we're gonna go ahead and work on the delete and then on the print report. All right, so let's go back to the application, and I'm gonna scroll to the left. So if you don't want this on one line, feel free to put it on a no line, but I'm just gonna keep it like this because I don't want to have it on a no line. Let's go ahead and copy the ping again, and I'm gonna scroll all the way to the bottom and put the delete there, paste. We're gonna call this delete server. So delete server, and we already know we only need the server ID, but you can put in the whole server here as well. So I'm going to pass in the whole server because we're going to need to use some other information on that server as well. But all we need to delete a server, at least from a backend perspective, is the server ID. And we can call the service again. This time we're going to call the delete. So delete, and we're going to pass it the server ID. You can see it's expecting the server ID. So we're going to say server.id. And I'm going to delete this line because we don't need this. We're not doing this. Delete down there as well. So we're going to return this line with the existing data while we make the HTTP call. All the errors, all this stuff is going to be the same. But when we get the response, we're going to do something else. So I'm going to delete all these lines again, and we're going to start anew. So what we want to do when we get the response is to just remove that server from our list and then return the new list, which is going to be pretty easy. So I'm going to copy this line of code. Actually, let me type it out so you guys can understand what I'm doing here, because at this point, I'm assuming you're familiar with most of the JavaScript array functions or methods. So that should be pretty easy for you. So we're going to say, hey, give me all the data. So we're going to say the data subject again, and then we're going to push a new object onto this data. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to do something similar. So we're going to say, all right, first of all, give me everything that you got from the response. So we're going to spread all the response data. Now we have all the metadata, all the timestamp, all the new message, everything in the response, we're returning it. Now we need to update the servers again. So to do this, we're going to access the data property because that's where the servers are. So we're going to say, okay, for my data, all right, which is where all the servers are, which is an object. So open and close curly braces. What we want to do is to override the servers. So servers is what we're overriding. So the list that we're showing. So what we're going to do is to just say, give me this, that data subject, that value, and the data, and access all the servers because it's an array. And we're just going to filter them. So we're going to call the filter method. All right. And I can actually put this on a new line. So I'm gonna put this whole thing on a new line. So remember, this is all for the data. And for the filter, we're gonna have to call a callback function. So open and close parentheses. And we're gonna say for every server that we're gonna loop through, because when we call the filter, it's gonna loop over every element in the array. And let's call the server, we already have a server defined. So that's gonna give us an error because we have server defined here. So that's gonna be a name collision. So let's say for every server S, right? We're gonna execute some piece of code. So error function, we're gonna say filter this if the server.id is different from the server that the user is trying to delete. So we're gonna say server, so the server in the method.id. And when we filter this, it's gonna look at this condition. It's gonna loop through every single server. So remember, this is an array, like a JavaScript array. It's gonna loop through every element in that array. It's gonna remove the element from the array if this condition is met. Otherwise, it's gonna keep it. So we're gonna say, okay, loop through the first one. Does it meet this condition? No, keep it in the array. Second one, does it meet this condition? No, keep it in the array. And then once it finds the one that meets this condition, then it's gonna remove it. And then our server list will be filtered and it's not gonna have this server that we just removed from the list or from the array. And that's pretty much all we have to do. We just filter the array, remove this one that we just deleted, and then return it again to the front end. And that's what we're doing here because we're calling next. So we're passing in a new piece of data. And then to access this data, we call the value. So now we just have to call this delete on the UI. So I'm gonna copy this, go back to the UI again. And this time we need to go to our table. So scroll to the left, scroll up, and this is our table. As you can see, we have our table here and we need this right there. Or we have to listen on a click event. So we're gonna say listen for a click event on this anchor tag. And what we want to execute is our function. So we're gonna say call this function and pass the server. Remember, we're still iterating. So if I scroll up a little bit, you can see that this ng4 in the table body right there. So we're looping over all the servers. So you can see this table body, it encapsulates this anchor tag, which means for every iteration, we're gonna have this same code for every single server that we have. So this server is the local variable name that we define up here. So it's gonna be the server in the current iteration. So we're gonna pass it here. So now we can go ahead and test it in the UI. So let's go back and let's delete this dummy data that we put in here. So delete that one, it's deleted, and we get the response back, server deleted. And remember, when we delete the server, we get this deleted true, which we can use in the front end. I mean, this is really up to you. Like, you can return whatever you want on the successful response. As you can see, this is going smoothly. And that's because I set my backend the way that I want to work with it in the front end. And that's why it's so smooth, because I know what I want it to do. Which means that at some point, even before I started doing any of the coding or anything, I thought about my design. So I might have a course later on design or a tutorial on design, like how to think about designing things and bring applications to life. But that's something you can be on the lookout for. But you have to understand that the backend needs to talk to the front end, and you have to make sure that you can do this in the easiest and the most efficient way possible. And I'm also going to remove that first one as well. So click on delete. And you can see that it's deleted, so server deleted. Now we have to go ahead and work on this report. So whenever we click print report, we want to print this table that we have here with all this information. And this is going to be pretty easy. This is really going to be just JavaScript and HTML and accessing element, and then make this work. So if you know how to do this in JavaScript, it's pretty much going to be the same thing, even though we're in Angular, because it's just still a JavaScript that we're using. So let's go ahead and work on that. So let's go back to the code, and we need to go to the TS file. I'm not going to copy this because this function is going to be pretty different from all these functions that we have here, because we're not going to be making any calls to the backend or dealing with observables or anything like that. So I'm going to go to the bottom and see if I can scroll up a little bit so you guys can see. And then I'm going to call this print report or something. You can name these whatever you want. And it's not going to take any parameters. And we're just going to access the HTML element for the table and then work with that. So that's going to return void. And then here, what we want to do is to just define some variables. So let data type, we need to define that. And we're going to set this equal to application So that's like application/JSON, like the MIME type of a spreadsheet. And I think what I chose, I looked this up and I chose a vnd.ms-excel.sheet.mark-macro enable.12. And if this is incorrect, like if I have a spelling mistake in this, it's just not going to work, and we can deal with this later. And then we need to define the table. So let's say let's say table select. And I'm coming up with these variable names as I go, so feel free to change them if they don't make sense to you. And let's get the table. So document.getElementById again. And I think I have an ID on that table, but I don't remember what it is. So we're gonna have to go and look up that ID. So let's go back and okay, so you can see at the table. So this is what we're looking for, the table tag right there. So we need to copy this ID and put it in here, just like that. Okay, so we're gonna grab the table as an element, like an HTML element, and we want this in encoded URL. So I'm gonna define a table HTML. So that's like the HTML representation in a more HTML or URL encoded format. And I'm gonna call the table select dot outer HTML and call the replace, because we need to replace the space with the encoded URL value for space, because if you don't do that, then it's not gonna work. And I'm gonna put // space / and then a G. And then I'm going to say replace this with the URL encoded for space, which is %20. So %20. And that's going to replace all the space with this URL encoded value for space. And this is important because otherwise it's not going to work. And then I need to create a link. So I'm going to say let download link. So this is going to be like the link to download, but we're not going to show it to the UI. We're going to click it programmatically. And I'm going to say document.createElement because I'm trying to create an element. So we're going to say create element. We need to create an enter tag. So we're going to say A. So we can put uppercase A, lowercase a, but I would go with lowercase. And then we need to add this link to the HTML. So we're going to say document.body. So we're going to add it to the body and then append child. And then we're going to pass in the link. So now this link is in the HTML as a tag. Okay, so that means that at some point we have to remove it, because if the user keeps pressing this, unless they refresh the page, then we're going to keep adding this element into the HTML, and we don't want to do that because that's just about design. And then we need to set the href, so downloadable link, href, which is a property on this. We're going to set it equal to data, and we want the data type. So we're going to say data type. So data type. And then we need a comma. So I'm going to put quotes and then comma and a space. And then I need to pass in my table. So here that's going to be the table HTML. So that's the href on the link. So it's data dash this data type. We could have all of this in one line, by the way, and then we pass in the table. Now we need to give a name to the file. So I'm going to say downloadable link that you do that by calling the download, and then you set whatever name that you want. In this case, I'm going to say server-report.xls. So that's extension, and we just need to click it. So let's do downloadable link, or I keep saying downloadable link, download link, and just click it. So after we click it, we also need to remove it from the document or from the body. So I'm gonna see if I can duplicate this line and then bring this down. I'm gonna do Control Z because I copied the wrong one. So that's the one, and then Alt down arrow key, and I need to do remove. So we're gonna say remove child, and then we pass in the same downloadable link. So every time we click it, it's gonna do all this, create the link and everything, process the table, give the user the option to download this by just calling the click, and then remove it from the UI or from the HTML markup. And feel free to simplify this if you want. Obviously, some of these variables I didn't really have to define them, but feel free to modify this in however you want. So now all we have to do is to just call this function on that button. So let's just copy this, and we're gonna go back to the UI, scroll up, and we're gonna look for this button, which is right here. You can see print report, just a regular button, and we can just add in a click listener. So we're gonna say, whenever you hear a click event occur, then call our function. And of course, this function doesn't take anything. We're just going to call it, and it's just going to do everything. So now if we go back, there's no error, everything refreshed properly. And I'm going to go ahead and print. You can see it at the bottom here. Okay, so the reason it didn't prompt me is because I'm not logged in. So you have to be logged in as a user for the browser to prompt you. At least that's what I've seen, but you can see that it's downloaded here at the bottom, and I can click it to open it. I'm gonna say yes, and there you go. So I can enable editing. What I usually do, well, if you've done anything with data, you know that data needs to be cleaned, and I can just select all these images, delete them, and select these two, and then delete them. Probably have all of the borders and bring this in the middle, zoom in, and there's your data. Another thing you can do is, instead of having this in Excel, like a spreadsheet like this, you can have it as a PDF. So to do this, which is also pretty easy, let's go back to the code. And what you can do is to just call the window.print. So we're gonna say window.print. You can see it's coming up here. Of course, it's a function. We need to add open and close parentheses and semicolon. And we don't want to do all this, so I'm gonna put all this and comment. When we call window print, it's going to give the default option from the browser to save the information, and then we can choose to save it as a PDF. So now if we go back and click on print again, you can see now we have this option, and we can just save it as a PDF. You can see here we can print it, or we can save it as a PDF, and you can see it's really nice. It looks really nice. So I'm not gonna do this. I just wanted to show you this. Let's go back to the code. If you want to do this, you can, but in my case, I'm not gonna do it. So I'm gonna uncomment this and then comment the first one out. And you can make this function take a value. You probably will need to make this like a drop down or something so the user can select, or you can add another button. I wouldn't add another button because it would be like redundant, but this button could be like print report or something. And then when they click it, they have a drop down like this, and they can select either to have it printed in a PDF format or as an Excel file. So it's up to you. I just thought that I would show you this, but I'm not gonna do this implementation. But feel free to do that to enhance your user experience or make it a lot better. So at this point, we have all of our features working. So you can go ahead and test this more, of course, but everything should be working. You know, pinging a server, delete a server, edit a server, and all that. So all this stuff should be working. Filter all the servers. All of this should be working. So now what we have to do is to show the little notification. So whenever, you know, we take an action here or we get some response from the back end, we want to show a little notification, the same one that you see when you're using Gmail. We have this little black message, like a little pop-up window that's very small. It's like a little notification, and then it tells you, you know, it gives you some information like, hey, this was successful, or you can't delete this because of whatever reason. So I want to implement something similar, and it's really overkill for this application, but I'm just giving you ideas. I'm just showing you how things can be done, and then you can take this information and then apply it to a much bigger application, a much more complicated application. So let's go ahead and work on that. So the package that I'm going to use to show the little notification is this package that you're looking at here. It's called Angular Notifier, and you can search it on NPM. You should be able to find it. You can see that it has different notification with different colors, indicate different type of information to the user. And I've implemented this before in some of my other courses or tutorial. And like I said, it's really overkill for this application, but it's a nice feature to have, and then I just see it in action. And I'm not going to use all these colorful ones. I'm pretty much going to use just this one, like the black one, the default, and we're gonna keep the messages very short so that they don't get too long into the screen, because I don't want them to be long. I want them to be like very small. So you can go to this documentation, you can see how to use it. If I scroll down, you can see that you put it in your ng module as you know, the notifier module. You import that inside of your ng module, the module you want to use it in. And then you pass in some configuration. You can see that you call with config. You pass in an object, which is going to be some configuration. And you need to put this notifier container inside of your main container. And what else? I think we have to import some style as well. So you're going to do this in your main style file to import some of the style that this needs to work. And then you can inject it in your component, like my awesome component, this example they're showing you. And then you can call it like this. And when you need to call the actual function that's going to actually show the notification, you call the notifier, and then you call notify. You give it a type of success that's going to determine the colors and everything, and then you pass in the message that you want to pass. So it's very simple to use, and that's what we're going to be using. And of course, you can scroll down, you can see a simple configuration. So that's a configuration for position, distance, gap, all this stuff. So I have a configuration that's predefined that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. And what we're going to do is, instead of using this the way that you see that they're showing us here, we're going to do something else that is a little bit more efficient. So instead of injecting it like this in our component and then having to pass it in our module like this, which is going to be quite some lines of code, we're going to actually create a module. So the same way that you see that we have this notifier module, right? We can create our custom module and then just put it in every module that we need to use. And I'm going to show you how this is going to happen. So let's go back to the code, right? So just to illustrate this a little bit more, I'm going to close all this for now. And let's go to the app module. So the app module is the only module that we have in the application. And you can think of the module as like a space for the app, right? So this module, we can have multiple different modules, by the way. So this module, it has all of this information that it has access to, or they are aware of each other. So whenever you want to use, let's say, a form in any of these files or whatever, then you bring in the forms module. Like you let the context of the application know that you need this module, or you need this code, or you need whatever Angular is doing in the backend for forms to be able to use the form. The same goes for HTTP client module, browser animation module, and the browser module. All this you need to bring in so that your application can work, the UI can work. Like the UI needs this browser module. So the same way we have these browser modules and HTTP client modules and forms module, you can actually create your own module. So I'm gonna take this this library, and then I'm gonna turn it into a module. And then all we have to do is to just bring it in here, just like we do like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this file, right, copy it, and I'm going to paste it in. So we're going to go inside the min app, paste it in, and I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to call it the notification module. Remove the copy.ts. Right, so this is going to be the module that we're going to be using. So I'm going to delete all of this because I'm not going to use them. We're going to use the ng module from Angular, and we don't need the declaration. So you can see this declaration right here, which is an array. We can get rid of that. And we need the import. We don't need the providers, so I'm going to remove that. And we need the export. So I'm going to say export, and this is also an array. Okay, so now we're getting a bunch of errors because we're not really doing anything yet. So gonna put this on the new line and remove this for now. And we also have to rename this. So we're gonna say notification module. Okay, so that's gonna be our module. We have to stick with the naming convention. So that's whatever the name is, and then module at the end. So this is the notification module, and I'm gonna go on top of the class, and I'm gonna define my configuration. I'm just gonna go ahead and paste it, and then we're gonna talk about it a little bit. So this is really, let's go ahead and import this. Well, we're not going to be able to import this because we didn't install the library. So let's go in and we didn't even do the most important thing. So let's copy this and let's go back to my terminal. Gonna stop this. Yes. Paste this. And then after that, we want to say ng serve. So after we install this, we're just going to run the app. So I'm going to minimize this or just bring the code back up. So I'm going to give this a few seconds and see if I can, there we go. So I can import this now. So make sure it comes from the Angular notifier, right? So this is the options or the custom notification options or the configuration, right? So we're going to need this configuration so that we can define how we want the notifications in the UI. So I want mine to be horizontally, they're going to be on the left, and then I want them to be at the bottom, 12. I don't know what this unit is in, but that's a distance from the screen on the left. That's a distance from the top, I believe. And we're gonna use the material theme and auto wide 5 millisecond. And you can see all these things that I'm putting in here. This animation, again, you need to have this browser animation module for this thing to work because it's using this browser animation module. And I'm just passing in some values here just to make it a little smooth. But the most important ones are this behavior and the position. So the position is pretty important. You have to set where you want this thing to be. And then all we have to do in our import is to just call the notification module. So that's supposed to come from the same package. And then we're gonna pass in the configuration. So we're gonna say with config and then pass in our custom configuration. So I'm gonna say custom configuration. So we pass in our custom configuration, we plug it in here as our import. and then we're just gonna import the notifier module. So now we're gonna copy this and then export it here. Not import, export. So we're pretty much just putting this in a file is what I'm gonna call this. And then we're gonna export it by that name, which is the notification module, this is the same thing we're doing here. We say for our import, we want to do all this work with this configuration and then export it. We need to do an import. So let me just copy this from the documentation. We have to do this. So we have to bring in those styles. So I'm going to copy this back to the app, and we're going to do another at import. So at import, and we don't need to do this because we already have the dependency in our nodes module. We can just point to it like this. Okay, so when you have this little, we don't need this /. When you have this little tilde or whatever that's called, and it's going to point to the nodes module. So we import the style, and now we have to do this one last thing. I think we have to do this. Okay, so this notifier container, we have to add it in some UI like HTML markup. So let's go back to the app and close this. And of course, we only have this one HTML, so we can just go in here, and I'm just gonna go ahead and scroll to the bottom of this and then just paste it here. Okay, so that should get this working. Now we just have to test it, and we can test this real quick just to make sure that it works. So let's go and do this. So I'm gonna copy this line back to the app, back in my mem component, and scroll up. I'm gonna do this a different way, but I just want to show you that it's actually working. I'm gonna paste this and make sure this is imported. Make sure it comes from Angular notifier, and we have to inject that in the constructor. So copy this back to the app, and we want to do this in the constructor. So I'm gonna do private and just paste this in here. Okay, so we inject this notification service. So now let's look at the example. Let's look at a simple example because I don't want this complicated. Okay, so let's look at this one. I'm gonna copy this, go back to the app, and let's say after we get this response, before we return, we're gonna just print this notification out. We don't have an ID, so I'm gonna remove this. So we have to pass this to this service. What if we do it that way? So let's say let's just remove this line. I think this should work as well. So we inject it in here, and then we call it down there. So let's see. Yep, there we go. So you can see that it's working properly. So I'm gonna refresh this one more time, and once the response come back, you can see that we have the message here. So we're gonna create a service and then use the service instead of using their own service. So let's go ahead and do that. Like I mentioned before, we're gonna turn this into our own service, so we don't have to use it that way. I mean, it's still gonna be injected, but we're gonna use it in our own way. So I'm gonna delete all this, delete this guy, remove that import as well. All right, and I wanna create another service. So let's go back here, and in our service folder, I'm gonna copy this file and then just paste it here. And I need to rename this to notification service. So we're gonna say notification service.ts. The first thing I want to do is to remove everything in here. So select everything, delete, and remove all these imports that we probably won't be using. And we need to rename this to notification service. Again, we could use the CLI to do this, but I was being lazy. Now we're gonna actually do exactly what they said in the documentation. So we're gonna create a private read only, and that's gonna be notifier, and we're gonna give it a type of notification service. So notification service, it's actually notifier service. Okay, so that's supposed to come from the library that we just installed. Now we need to create a constructor. So constructor, we're gonna pass in the notifier service. So notifier service, which is going to be of type notifier service, and we need to do an assignment. So we're going to say this dot notifier, set it equal to the notifier service, and it's supposed to be that one. And this is misspelled. This is supposed to be service, notifier service, and this should also be changed to notifier service. Okay, so now what we want to do is to define some methods. So I'm going to say on default, Okay, so I'm defining this method inside of this service, and all it takes is a message, which is gonna be a string. Okay, so it's gonna take a message that's gonna be a string. Return type is void, and then all we have to do is to call the notifier and then call notify, and then we're gonna pass in the default. Let's pass in the string for now, so that's gonna be the default, and then we need to pass in the message, and we already have the message, so we're gonna call the message. Another thing I want to do is to create an enum for the type of the message so that we can have this in a more clean way. So I'm going to go outside of the class, and I'm going to create an enum, and I'm going to call it maybe type because it makes more sense. And then I'm going to pass in the different types. So the first one is default. So default, and we're going to set it equal to a string default. So default. And then I'm going to copy this again and then paste it, and this time this is going to be the info. So info, and then change this to info, paste it one more time. This is going to be the success, and then we have warning, the last one is error. Change this to error. So we have all of the different types that we can have, so we can just use that type. So I can say type, paste it in here, and then call the default. And I'm gonna put this on a no line so you guys can see better. All right, so we have all the different enums here. So now we can have a function for all the different types. So I'm gonna copy this, or just highlight it and do this. And we want the on success, so we're gonna say on success, and just change the type to success. Do this one more time, and let's call this on info, and we just need to change the type again to info. We're gonna do this again, and this is gonna be on warning. Change the type again to warning. And we're going to copy this one last time, and then we're going to call this on error. All right, so I'm defining my own function and I'm calling the service. So what we can do now is to just use this notification service inside of our class, and all we have to do is to pass in the message. We don't have to worry about this type or whatever, because this implementation is going to work. So I'm going to copy this name, and I can pretty much close this. I don't need to be here anymore, and close all this. And we need to go inside of the main component, and we're just going to inject it here just like a regular service. So I'm going to say private, and then pass it here, and make sure you import this, and I'm going to change this name to notifier. Okay, so we're going to call this notifier. So now all I have to do is to just call this notifier, and then, you know, pass in on default or on error or something. So after we got the successful response, which is going to happen here, we're going to say this that notifier, and you can see that we have our own method. So I'm going to be using just the default and the error in case I get an error, but feel free to use any one of these. And you can also define your own, because right now we're using our own service, so you don't have to be stuck with the ones that you got from the library. You can define your own, but in my case I'm just going to use the default, and then I'm going to pass in the message. And remember, the message is coming from the response, so I'm going to say response.message. There should be a message property on the response, and I'm going to copy this and then go down. So when we get an error as well, remember this error is a string. We can also show it to the user. So I'm going to pass it here, and then pass the error as my message because it's a string, and then we're going to call on error. So I'm going to copy this line, and we're going to do this for all the other functions. So scroll down. We can do it anytime, like maybe after this occurs, then we can do this. After we save the server, then we can do this as well. And when we filter, we can pass in this message as well. And when we delete, we can pass in the same message. All right, whatever message we get from the backend is gonna be printed out here. You can put it on this method here as well, but you're gonna have to come up with a message if you want. Like we can do something like do report downloaded or something. So that's up to you. You can do it in any function in this class. And then we're gonna do the same for the error. So let's just go up, and we're gonna copy this line, and then we're gonna do it for all the errors. So whenever there's an error, we wanna show the error as well. Show the error, show the error, and let's go down. show the error here, and we don't have an error. Well, an error can happen here, but we're not gonna catch this error that way. Remember, this is coming from a backend call. So now I'm gonna go ahead and go back to the app, and if I, for instance, filter this, you can see the message at the bottom. Every time I take an action, the message is gonna appear. And if I try to print, you can see the message, report downloaded. I'm gonna close that for now. And if I ping a server, for example, ping success, this is gonna be an error. So let's see the error message, ping fail. You can see that the ping fail is right there. So everything is working as expected, and feel free to go ahead and test this more, but in my case that's gonna work for me. I already know that it works, but you can go ahead and look at it and understand the flow and then test it more. There's a question that I think you might be asking yourself, which is, why would you try to build your application using the reactive approach when you can just use, the procedural approach and everything would work fine? Well, in addition to all the advantages of not having to subscribe and unsubscribe in the components, you also have performance advantage. So Angular in the backend use something called a change detection strategy. And by default, it's going to use the check always strategy, which is always going to be checking for changes in the component and then update the UI appropriately. And what Angular is doing is it's looking for every change in all your components for everything that is bound in the UI, and then update everything appropriately in case there's a change in the component. However, when you use a reactive approach, you have the option to use the onPush strategy, which is only going to look for change when there is an input change. So if you're using the input and then there's a change on that property on the class, or when you're using event emitters and then there's an event that is emitted, or in our case, when you're using observable and the observable emits. So because we're only using observable and we're subscribing in the template or in the UI using the async pipe, we can actually improve our entire application performance by using the onPush change detection. And I'm going to show you how we're going to do this right now. So let's go back to the application and implement this strategy. So we're going to scroll all the way up. So you know that we can pass metadata in the add component, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to go up here, and then I'm going to put a comma and then go on a new line, and then I'm going to type in change detection. You can see it's coming up here, and we're going to call the change detection strategy, and then we're going to change this to onPush. What this is going to do is it's going to check for changes only when this component initializes. So for example, if I had a variable like name equal, and then let's say I set this to junior, right? So whenever the component is initialized, I have this name and I'm using it in the UI using, string interpolation or whatever, then it's going to read this and say, all right, okay, so this value is junior. This is only going to happen when the component initializes, like the first time this component is loaded. And then if somewhere down there, I change the value of this name. So I do this, that name equal, and then I set it to a different string. Angular is not going to pick up this change because we only have the onPush. It's not going to look again for changes in the component and then update the UI. It's only going to do that for input, for when an observable emits, or when there is an event that emits some value. And in our case, we have observable. So all of these, well, we don't have a whole lot of things. We only have the entire application, which is inside of this observable. And then we have the filter observable and the loading observable. And I didn't need to have those in this class. I could have encapsulated them inside of this app data, but I just decided to put these two in the actual component itself. But I could have put these two properties inside of this object and then update it appropriately, and then use the app data, so this guy and the component, to manage this, is loading and the filter status. So we could do that as well. That's another way you can actually tackle this. But Angular is not going to check for any variable that you set like this. It's only going to check once when the component initialized, and it's not going to check ever again. So whenever you change this value, even if it's bound in the UI, it's not going to reflect. And you can see that we don't have anything that we're changing here. We have these two variables that were defined here. We're not setting them to anything else anywhere else in this class, right? We're just defining them here so that we can use them in the UI. So we don't have anything defined like a typical variable like this. We only have observables. So because observables are gonna, push changes, and the onPush is going to detect those and it's going to update the UI accordingly. So if we go to the application right now, we're not going to see like any difference because, the performance improvement for this little application is probably minimal. Like you probably won't even be able to detect it. But that's a little bit more of an advanced topic, more advanced things that you can do with Angular when you're building your application. So you can take advantage of these little things. Right now, this is small, like it doesn't even matter. But when the application is very large and the default, so if I type in D, you can see the default here And if we go in there, you can see the default is always checking. So it has a check always strategy. So it's constantly watching every variable that you set equal to something here that you change either here or in some other component, and it's watching for those changes. So the library is working really hard to keep track of all these changes. But when we change it to onPush, remember, it's only going to check for input changes or when an event emits or when there is an observable that emits, which is what we're doing here. So this is definitely going to improve our performance. And that's why I wanted to show you an example where you can do that in your application. So now if we go back to the UI, everything should be the same, like everything will work. Nothing's going to be broken because we're binding these values to the component using observable. We're not using like typical variable declaration. And you can go ahead and test. Everything else should work as well. We can still ping or we can delete. Everything will work. So that's pretty much everything that I had for this course. And again, if you have any questions or something is not clear, go ahead and reach out to me. I'll be glad to help you. And you might not want to do this every single time. Like for this application, for example, like I didn't really have to do it that way. But if this application were to grow, then you would see how this approach would be very, very helpful when the application gets really complex. But in a lot of cases, you don't really have to do this because your application is not gonna, have any complexities in it. Performance is really not something that you should worry about. So probably this approach is not something that you wanna kill yourself to do, but it's a little bit of a more advanced way of coding with Angular. And the guys at Google's and the big companies, that's how they create all this fancy application like Gmail and stuff. So that's how these applications are built. They're built in a very smooth and performance aware way because those applications have really, really heavy loads. And again, like I said, you might not want to do that every single time when you're building a little application, but it's a very, very interesting way or a very interesting approach to take when you're building your application. And again, if you have any question, reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you, and I'll see you guys in the next one.